The stinging ammonia in a hot coop is not just an unpleasant smell to be tolerated. It is proof that the birds have already been breathing something that quietly harms them. The same dead, stale air settles into closed bedrooms and sick rooms every summer. There is a material that cools incoming air and strips the foulness out of it at once. It is the very same substance sealed inside the purifiers people pay hundreds of dollars for. A farmer in Lancaster County builds the whole thing for the price of a single sandwich. It takes about $7 and 15 honest minutes to assemble at any open window. It runs on nothing but clean water, and the ordinary breeze already moving through the gap. There is one real safety rule that most people miss, and he refuses to skip over it. The reason almost no one knows this is not that it failed, but that no one profits from it. Step inside a chicken coop on an August afternoon in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and your body registers the problem before your mind has time to name it. The heat hits first, a wall of it, thick and pressurized, the kind that makes you blink. Then the smell arrives, and it is not merely unpleasant the way a garbage bin is unpleasant. Ammonia has a particular quality that sets it apart from ordinary farmyard odors. It does not sit politely in the background. It climbs directly into the sinuses and lodges there, sharp and chemical, the kind of smell that makes a grown adult back instinctively toward the door within the first 3 seconds of entering. The birds are panting. Not occasionally, not one or two of the weaker ones, but the whole flock, beaks open, standing still in the straw, conserving every calorie of energy they possess. Their wings hang slightly away from their bodies, a posture that means one thing. The heat inside has become a problem they are actively trying to solve and failing. Here is what the smell is actually telling you. And this is the part most visitors to a summer coop do not know. Researchers at the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension have established that ammonia concentrations above 25 parts per million begin physically damaging the lining of a bird's respiratory tract. Feed conversion drops. Immune response weakens. The bird becomes measurably more vulnerable to disease. The critical detail is the timing. By the moment a human nose registers ammonia as unpleasant, the concentration inside that coop has already been sitting at harmful levels for some time. The birds did not begin suffering when you walked in and wrinkled your nose. They have been enduring this for hours, perhaps since the previous evening when ventilation slowed and the temperature inside began its long, slow climb. A chicken cannot sweat. This is not a trivial anatomical footnote, but the central biological fact that makes summer heat in an enclosed space genuinely dangerous for poultry. Without sweat glands, the bird's only heat-shedding mechanism is panting, which pushes warm air across the moist surfaces of the throat and airways. Panting works, but only up to a point, and in a coop where the incoming air itself is already hot and laden with ammonia, panting becomes a transaction with diminishing returns. Temperatures climbing into the low 30s Celsius, roughly the low 90s in Fahrenheit, push a chicken toward heat stress. Sustained exposure beyond that threshold can tip toward heat stroke and, in a bad year during a genuine heat wave, toward losses that a small flock keeper feels personally and financially for the rest of the season. The tragedy is not that the problem is invisible. It is that the smell announces it loudly, and most people treat the announcement as an inconvenience rather than an alarm. Stand in that coop for 60 seconds and you have experienced in a mild and temporary form a version of what those birds live inside for the entire summer. The difference is that you will walk back out into the open air. They will not. Whatever air quality exists inside that building is the only air quality they will ever have access to, which transforms the question of ventilation from a comfort issue into something closer to a welfare obligation. Beyond that, the problem is not unique to poultry. Walk from the coop directly into a farmhouse bedroom that has been closed against the afternoon heat with the windows shut and the curtains drawn. The ammonia is gone, replaced by the particular staleness of recycled human air, carbon dioxide building slowly, the faint sourness of a room that has been breathing itself all day. A sick room in July. A child's bedroom with the window painted shut. A basement apartment in a city where the only ventilation is a gap under the door. The physics are identical, even if the smell is different. Hot, still contaminated air is not a problem that belongs exclusively to farms. It belongs to any enclosed space where living things breathe and where the air coming in receives no treatment before it arrives. That shared condition is exactly the ground on which the solution, when it arrives, will stand. Because what works in the co-op works in the bedroom, and it costs roughly the same either way, which is almost nothing. The farmer who figured this out did not have access to a $300 purifier or a whole house ventilation system. What he had was a bag of material from the pet aisle, a shallow tray, and a working understanding of two tricks that physics has been offering to anyone willing to pay attention for several thousand years. Close the coop door behind you and carry the memory of that air into the house. The transition is the point. What just assaulted your senses in the barn is operating by the same physical laws as the air in the room where someone you love is trying to sleep through a heat wave with the windows sealed against the noise outside. The closed bedroom is a slower version of the same problem. There is no ammonia, no visible distress, no flock of panting birds to make the stakes legible. There is only a person lying on top of the covers at 2 in the morning. Not quite asleep, not quite comfortable, breathing air that has been cycling through the same sealed space since sundown. Carbon dioxide accumulates in a closed sleeping room faster than most people realize. A single adult exhales roughly 200 cubic centimeters of carbon dioxide with every breath. And over the course of a night that adds up to a meaningful shift in the composition of the air in a small room. Studies measuring cognitive performance in closed rooms have found measurable impairment at concentrations that a sealed bedroom can reach by early morning, which means the grogginess many people attribute to poor sleep is sometimes the air itself. Heat compounds everything. A room that was tolerable at 9 in the evening, when the walls still held the coolness of the previous night, becomes noticeably warmer by midnight as the thermal mass of the building releases the day's stored heat. By 3 in the morning in July, a sealed interior room in a brick building in a city like Philadelphia or Baltimore can be several degrees warmer than the outdoor air, the opposite of what the person inside assumed when they shut the window. The sick room is the extreme version of this dynamic. Illness raises body temperature, and a feverish person in a closed room generates additional heat while simultaneously needing the cleanest possible air to support recovery. Hospitals understand this, which is why clinical ventilation standards specify a minimum number of complete air changes per hour in patient rooms. The number is not arbitrary. It reflects the understanding that stale, warm, contaminated air is not a neutral background condition. It is an active participant in how sick a person feels and how quickly they recover. A farmhouse in Lancaster County in the 1980s had none of this clinical infrastructure. What it had was a tradition of solving problems with materials that were available, cheap, and grounded in an understanding of how the physical world actually behaves. The man who would eventually demonstrate this solution grew up in that tradition, and the solution he arrived at addresses the bedroom and the sick room by exactly the same mechanism it addresses the co-op, because the mechanism does not care what species is breathing the treated air. Just imagine sitting in a room where the incoming air has already been cooled by several degrees and scrubbed of the volatile compounds that make stale air feel oppressive without a single electrical component running, without a filter subscription, without a monthly bill. That is not a hypothetical. It is a description of what happens when moving air passes over a surface that has been prepared in a specific and very simple way. The bridge between the coop and the bedroom matters because it establishes the scope of what is coming. This is not a niche agricultural tip for people who keep chickens. It is a ventilation principle that applies wherever air moves through an opening into a space where living things breathe. Which is to say, it applies almost everywhere. The farmer who built the version in his coop vent built the same version for the room where his youngest child recovered from a chest illness one summer, and the logic he applied was identical in both cases. What's more, the materials cost the same whether the application is a 100-bird-laying flock or a single-bedroom window. The physics do not charge extra for the human version, and the person who arrived at this solution did not hold a degree in building science or thermodynamics. He learned it the way most genuinely useful knowledge gets learned, by watching what worked, understanding why it worked, and then building a version with his own hands that he could explain to anyone willing to stand still long enough to listen. His name is Elias Yoder, and he has been farming the same land outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for more than 30 years. He has never owned an air conditioner. He has never paid for a replacement filter cartridge. And on the hottest afternoons of the year, the air moving through his coops and through the window of his farmhouse is cooler and cleaner than the air most people are paying significant money to approximate with machinery that fills a landfill when it breaks. The question of how he does it opens onto something much older than one farmer's ingenuity, something that reaches back through centuries of human problem-solving to a time when the only engineering tools available were observation, materials at hand, and a willingness to trust what the physical world was demonstrating rather than what a salesman was asserting. Elias Yoder's farm sits on a gentle slope about 8 miles southeast of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on land his family has worked for 4 generations. The house faces east, which means the morning light comes through the kitchen windows first and the prevailing afternoon breeze from the southwest moves across the fields before it reaches the buildings. He knows this the way a sailor knows the harbor, not from a chart, but from 30 years of daily observation. He is not a man who uses many words to establish his credibility. When he walks you through his operation, he shows you things rather than telling you about them, lifting a corner of burlap here, pointing to a particular gap in the vent slats there, letting the evidence speak before he offers the explanation. This manner of communication is not performance. It is the default mode of a tradition that has been solving practical problems without institutional support for several centuries. The Amish community in Lancaster County represents one of the most densely documented examples of technology-selective self-sufficiency in the modern world. Choices about which tools to adopt and which to decline are made not from ignorance of the alternatives, but from a deliberate evaluation of what a given technology does to the fabric of a community and a household. Elias did not reject mechanical air conditioning because he failed to understand it. He understood it well enough to conclude that what it required of him, in cost, in dependence, in the ongoing relationship with a supplier, was more than he was willing to give. What he built instead draws on a principle so old that its origins are genuinely difficult to trace. Evaporative cooling and carbon-based air filtration are not inventions of the modern era. They are rediscoveries of physical facts that human beings have been exploiting in various forms for millennia, and the version Elias assembles in his barn costs roughly $7 in materials from the pet aisle of any farm supply store. He has built it, maintained it, and refined it over more than 2 decades of summer heat in southeastern Pennsylvania. Here is the thing about Elias that matters most for understanding why his solution works, as well as it does. He does not approach the problem as a cooling problem or a filtration problem separately. He approaches it as an air quality problem, a single question about what condition the air should be in when it reaches the animals or the people inside a given space, and he addresses both dimensions of that question with a single tray of material that costs less than a restaurant lunch. The credibility of what he is about to show you does not rest on his authority alone. It rests on the underlying physics, which are verifiable, and on a history of human application that stretches back far enough to predate the nation he lives in by several thousand years. But Elias is a useful starting point because he represents something the air conditioning industry is structurally unable to offer: a person with no financial stake in which solution you choose, demonstrating a method that requires you to buy nothing from him and nothing from anyone else after the initial $7 investment. He will make one promise before he begins, and it is stated in the plainest possible terms. He will not dress this up to make it seem more impressive than it is. He will tell you exactly what it does, exactly what it does not do, and exactly where the one genuine safety risk lives, because a solution that harms the people it is supposed to help is not a solution at all. That honesty, offered without preamble or qualification, is the first indication that what follows is worth the next several minutes of your attention. The farm itself is the best argument for everything he is about to say. On an afternoon in late July, when the temperature in Lancaster County sits at 91 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity is climbing toward 70%, the air inside his main coop is cooler than the air outside by a measurable margin. The birds are not panting. The ammonia smell that would normally build through the afternoon is largely absent. The air moving through the vent at the north end of the building carries a faint mineral coolness that is immediately noticeable when you step inside from the heat. He did not achieve this with machinery. He achieved it with a shallow wooden frame fitted with wire mesh on one face, packed with the specific material available at any pet supply store, wetted with water from the farm's hand pump, and positioned at the intake vent where the afternoon breeze enters the building. The whole assembly took him about 15 minutes to build the first time and about 2 minutes each morning to maintain. The material inside the frame cost him approximately $6.50 on his last purchase, and a single bag has lasted him through most of a summer before requiring the simple regeneration process he will describe later. This is the promise stated without decoration. $7, 15 minutes, 2 physical principles that have been understood for centuries, and one rule that must not be broken. Everything else is detail, and the detail begins with the oldest trick in the history of human thermal management, the one your own body has been performing without your conscious instruction every single day of your life. $7 is a specific number, and Elias is precise about it because precision is a form of respect for the person listening, not a few dollars or almost nothing or pocket change, which are phrases that mean different things to different people and commit to nothing. $7 is what a single bag of aquarium-grade activated charcoal costs at the pet aisle of a farm supply store in Lancaster County as of the last several years, and that single bag is the primary material in a system that performs 2 distinct jobs simultaneously, jobs that the air conditioning and air purification industries have built separate product lines to address. The 2 jobs are cooling and cleaning. Not approximately cooling, not sort of cleaning, but a measurable reduction in air temperature and a genuine removal of volatile organic compounds, ammonia, odors, and airborne particulates from the air passing through the system. These are not claims that require trust in Elias personally. They are claims that require trust in the physics of evaporation and the chemistry of activated carbon, both of which have been verified independently in contexts ranging from military gas mask development to hospital filtration systems to the aquarium hobby, where clean water chemistry is a matter of life and death for the animals involved. 15 minutes is also a specific number, and it refers to the construction time for the most basic functional version of the system, which requires no tools beyond a pair of hands, a shallow tray of any kind, and access to water. A more refined version, the wooden frame and wire mesh assembly that Elias uses in his co-op vent, takes perhaps an additional 10 minutes and requires a handsaw and a few screws. Neither version demands skill beyond the ability to spread a material evenly in a container and carry it to a window. The dual function aspect is the part that consistently surprises people who encounter this for the first time. The assumption, shaped by years of marketing that sells cooling and purification as separate problems requiring separate solutions, is that a single, inexpensive material doing both jobs simultaneously must be doing at least one of them inadequately. This assumption is wrong, and understanding why it is wrong requires understanding what activated charcoal actually is at the physical level, which Elias will get to shortly. For now, the relevant point is architectural. 1 tray, 1 material, 1 placement, 2 results. Consider what the air purification industry sells as its entry-level product. A basic activated carbon air purifier from any major American retailer carries a price between $150 and $400 for the unit itself, followed by replacement filter cartridges that cost between $20 and $60 each and require changing every 3 to 6 months depending on usage. The carbon inside those cartridges is the same fundamental material available in the pet aisle for $7 a bag. The housing, the fan motor, the indicator light, the brand name, and the replacement filter subscription model account for the remainder of the price differential. What's more, the evaporative cooling function is not offered by those purifiers at all. It is sold separately as a standalone evaporative cooler or swamp cooler, which adds another $100 to $300 to the household budget and requires its own maintenance schedule, its own water supply system, and in many models, its own replacement pad subscription. Elias's tray does both. The same surface that holds water for evaporative cooling also holds activated charcoal for adsorption, and the 2 functions reinforce each other in a way that will become clear once the underlying mechanisms are explained. The 15-minute build produces something that can be placed at any window or vent opening where air naturally moves into a space. It requires no electricity, though adding a small fan improves performance in still air conditions. It requires no installation, no mounting hardware, no landlord permission. A person renting an apartment in Philadelphia or Chicago can assemble this on a Saturday morning and have it functioning before noon, and can take it apart and carry it to the next apartment without leaving a mark on the walls. Here is the thing that Elias finds most worth saying before he shows the build itself. The system does not hide its limitations. It will not cool a room by 20 degrees. It will not eliminate every pathogen in the air or protect against serious airborne illness in a clinical sense. What it will do, reliably and verifiably, is reduce the temperature of incoming air by a meaningful margin in dry conditions. Strip out the ammonia and volatile compounds that make enclosed spaces feel oppressive, and do both of these things continuously for as long as it receives water and airflow, which in a naturally ventilated space costs nothing at all. That honest accounting of capability is itself a distinguishing feature. The marketing copy on a $300 purifier does not begin with a statement of what the product cannot do. It begins with the largest possible claim about what it can, because the business model depends on the purchase being made before the limitation is discovered. Elias has no such incentive. The $7 have already been spent. What remains is only the question of whether the person standing in front of the tray understands it well enough to use it correctly. Understanding it correctly means understanding two separate physical principles, each of which is simple enough to explain in a single sentence and deep enough to have sustained entire branches of engineering for more than a century. The first principle is one your skin demonstrates every morning when you step out of a shower into a cool bathroom. The second principle is one that saved soldiers' lives in the trenches of northern France in 1915, and which sits, largely unacknowledged, inside the filter cartridge of nearly every air purifier sold in America today. Walk into any large American retailer on a hot July afternoon, and the air purifier aisle presents itself as a wall of considered engineering. Brushed aluminum housings, digital displays cycling through air quality readings, brand names that suggest clinical authority. The price tags begin around $80 for the smallest units and climb past $400 for models marketed toward allergy sufferers or parents of young children, and the packaging of nearly every unit above $150 carries some version of the phrase activated carbon filter in the list of featured technologies. Pull that filter out of its housing. It is a flat or cylindrical panel, usually gray or black, sometimes bonded to a layer of fibrous material, and it smells faintly mineral when new. The active ingredient, the component doing the actual work of capturing odors and volatile compounds from the passing air, is activated carbon. The same material. Not a refined pharmaceutical grade unavailable to the general public, not a proprietary compound developed in a private laboratory, but the same activated carbon sold in the aquarium section of any pet supply store for between $5 and $8 a bag. The aquarium hobby depends on water clarity the way a hospital depends on sterile surfaces, and aquarium keepers have understood the chemistry of activated carbon for decades. They use it in filter beds to strip chlorine, tannins, dissolved organic compounds, and odor-causing molecules from tank water, because fish are considerably less forgiving of water quality lapses than most household plants. The activated carbon in an aquarium filter and the activated carbon in a $400 air purifier are performing chemically identical operations on different fluids, one liquid and one gas, using the same adsorptive mechanism. Beyond that, the carbon inside a premium purifier's filter cartridge is often a lower grade than what a serious aquarium keeper would purchase, because the purifier's design prioritizes a flat pressure drop across the filter surface over maximum adsorptive capacity per gram. A thick bed of loose aquarium carbon, the kind Elias spreads in his tray, presents more total surface area to passing air than the thin bonded layer in most residential filter cartridges, which means the $7 material is not merely equivalent to the expensive version. In some measurable respects, it outperforms the packaged product it resembles. The replacement filter business model is worth examining plainly, because it explains the pricing structure better than any appeal to manufacturing cost. A purifier sold at $150 with $60 replacement cartridges required every 4 months generates $240 in filter revenue over the first 2 years of ownership, which exceeds the original purchase price. This is not a hidden conspiracy. It is a standard recurring revenue model, well documented in the appliance industry and openly discussed in business journalism. And it works because the customer who has already paid for the housing is a captive audience for the consumable. Elias's tray has no housing to amortize and no cartridge to replace. The activated charcoal in it does eventually saturate with captured compounds, at which point its adsorptive capacity diminishes. But the regeneration process costs nothing and requires only sunlight and time, a fact that will be addressed in full when the maintenance section arrives. For now, the relevant point is that the material is not consumed by use the way a paper filter is consumed. It is temporarily loaded and then it can be unloaded and then it can be loaded again, a cycle that a bag of aquarium carbon can sustain through multiple seasons before the material genuinely requires replacement. The historical dimension of this comparison is worth a moment of attention, because it transforms the framing from cheap alternative to original application. Activated carbon's use as an air filtration medium was not invented by the consumer appliance industry. It was formalized out of military necessity during the First World War, when the chemist James Burt Garner and his colleagues developed activated charcoal gas mask filters in 1915, working under the pressure of chemical weapon attacks on the Western Front. Soldiers in the trenches of northern France were surviving or not surviving based on whether the carbon in their masks was adequate to the task. The technology that a retailer now sells in a brushed aluminum housing with a digital display descends directly from that wartime survival tool. The material inside the cartridge is the same class of material that stood between a soldier and a gas attack in 1915. What the intervening century contributed was not a fundamental improvement in the chemistry, but a housing, a fan, a price point, and a subscription model for the replaceable component. Elias did not invent a workaround. He returned to the original application, stripped of everything that was added for commercial reasons rather than functional ones. You won't believe this, but the labels on most replacement filter cartridges do not explain any of this. They do not describe the adsorption mechanism, do not specify the surface area of the carbon they contain, do not tell the buyer that the material inside can, in principle, be regenerated rather than discarded. The instructions say to replace the cartridge on schedule and to dispose of the old one. This is accurate advice for maximizing the revenue the product generates. It is not a complete account of what the material is capable of or what the buyer might do if they understood it better. Standing in Elias's barn on a July afternoon, holding a handful of the same material that fills those cartridges, bought from the pet aisle for a fraction of the cartridge price, the gap between what the industry sells and what the physics actually requires becomes impossible to unsee. The air moving through his coop vent is cooler than the air outside. It carries none of the ammonia that saturated it an hour ago. And the tray producing this result cost him $7 and about 15 minutes to assemble, sitting in a wooden frame that he built from scrap lumber with a handsaw and 4 screws. The machine that does this job in a retail context does not exist as a single unit. You would need a swamp cooler for the temperature reduction and a purifier for the air cleaning, 2 separate purchases, 2 separate maintenance schedules, 2 separate recurring costs. Elias's tray does both at the same time, from the same surface, using the same material, placed at the same window. Before that can be fully understood, 2 physical principles need to be laid out plainly, and the first one has been keeping human beings alive in hot climates for longer than recorded history can reliably trace. Elias picks up a handful of the material from the open bag and holds it out for inspection. It is black, irregular in shape, lightweight for its apparent volume, and it leaves a faint, dark residue on the palm. It looks at first glance like something that belongs in a grill rather than a ventilation system, and that resemblance is the source of the single most important mistake a person can make when attempting to build this system. He addresses the mistake immediately, before anything else, because he considers it the difference between a tool and a hazard. The material is activated charcoal, and he wants to be precise about what that phrase means and what it does not mean, because the word charcoal carries associations that will lead a person in exactly the wrong direction if they are not corrected early. He is not describing the compressed briquettes sold in bags near the lighter fluid at any hardware store. He is not describing lump hardwood charcoal of the kind used in ceramic grills. He is describing a specific processed material available in the aquarium section of any pet supply store, and the difference between that material and the briquette is not a matter of degree, but of kind. What's more, he does not want to use the technical properties of the material to build a case for its impressiveness before the listener has a chance to evaluate it honestly. The instinct in this kind of demonstration is to lead with the most astonishing fact, to drop a number so large that the audience is captured by the spectacle before the skepticism has time to form. He resists that instinct deliberately. The spectacle, he says, is not the point. The function is the point. And function is best understood by starting with what the material does rather than what it is. So he makes a pledge before the explanation begins, stated plainly and without theater. He will tell you what this system does well, and he will tell you what it does not do well in the same breath, with the same candor, because a person who leaves with an accurate understanding of a $7 tool is more valuable to the community of people trying to solve real problems than a person who leaves impressed by a presentation and disappointed by a result. He has seen the disappointed result. Someone builds the system expecting refrigeration-grade cooling and then reports that it failed, when in fact it performed exactly as the physics predicted, and the person simply needed more accurate expectations. The honesty pledge covers 3 specific items. First, the cooling effect is real but modest, and its magnitude depends heavily on the humidity of the local air, a dependency he will explain in full and with enough detail that any viewer in any region of the country can predict their own result before they spend $1. Second, the air cleaning function is genuine but not equivalent to medical-grade filtration, and anyone managing a serious respiratory illness in a clinical sense should not treat this as a substitute for professional guidance. Third, there is one safety condition that converts this tool from beneficial to dangerous, and he will not allow that condition to pass without a complete and unambiguous explanation. Here is the thing that distinguishes this pledge from the disclaimers printed in small type at the bottom of a product manual. Those disclaimers exist to protect the manufacturer from liability. This one exists to protect the person building the system from a genuine hazard. And it is offered first, before the promise, before the build instructions, before the list of applications, because Elias considers the order of information to be itself a form of honesty. You learn what can go wrong before you learn how to make it go right, because a person who understands the risk is a person who will manage it correctly. The particular kind of charcoal required is sold under several names in the aquarium aisle. It may be labeled as activated carbon, activated charcoal, or aquarium filter carbon, and it appears in loose granular form in mesh bags or in bulk containers. The price ranges from $5 to $8 depending on quantity and brand, and any of the standard aquarium grades will perform the dual function Elias is about to demonstrate. The specific surface area of the material, the physical property that makes it useful, varies by grade, but even the most basic aquarium carbon presents a surface area per gram that would strike most people as implausible if stated plainly. He will state it plainly in a moment, because the number is central to understanding why a single shallow tray of this material can do what it does. A single gram of activated carbon, a quantity small enough to sit comfortably on a fingernail, presents a surface area in the range of 500 to 1,500 square meters, depending on the grade and processing method. For comparison, a standard tennis court covers approximately 260 square meters. 1 gram of this material, held in a closed fist, contains the equivalent of several tennis courts worth of surface, folded into a microscopic labyrinth of pores and channels that passing air must navigate on its way into the room. That number is not offered to impress. It is offered because without it, the 2 functions of the material, holding water for evaporative cooling and capturing molecules for adsorption, seem like separate and coincidental properties of the same substance. With it, both functions become inevitable consequences of the same physical structure, and the tray stops seeming like a folk remedy and starts seeming like what it actually is, a low-cost application of a principle that industrial engineers have been exploiting for more than a century, now sitting in a shallow wooden frame in a barn in Lancaster County, doing its job quietly and at a cost that rounds to nothing. Before the number becomes fully meaningful, two mechanisms need to be understood, and the first one begins not in a laboratory or a barn, but on the surface of human skin. On any warm morning, in any place on earth where a person has ever stood in a light breeze after getting wet and felt with sudden clarity what moving air can do to temperature when water is present to help it. Step out of a swimming hole on a July afternoon and stand in the shade while the breeze moves across your wet skin. The cooling that follows is immediate, specific, and surprisingly powerful relative to the modest conditions producing it. The air temperature has not changed. The shade has reduced radiant heat from the sun, but the dramatic drop you feel on your skin is coming from somewhere else entirely, from the water leaving your body and taking something with it that has nothing to do with the water itself. What the water takes when it evaporates is heat, and the quantity of heat involved in that transaction is genuinely striking when expressed as a number. Water absorbs approximately 2,260 kilojoules of energy per kilogram as it transitions from liquid to vapor, a figure known in thermodynamics as the latent heat of vaporization. To put that in terms a kitchen scale can make concrete. 1 kilogram of water, roughly the contents of a standard water bottle, carries away enough heat energy as it evaporates to cool that same mass of water by more than 500 degrees Celsius if the heat were applied in reverse. The evaporation of a modest amount of water from a wet surface is not a gentle or marginal thermal event. It is a substantial energy transfer disguised as something invisible. Your body has known this for as long as bodies have existed. Sweat is not a cooling system in the sense that it lowers your temperature directly. It is a delivery mechanism for water onto a warm surface where the evaporation does the actual thermal work. The breeze accelerates the process by carrying away the humid air directly above the skin surface, which would otherwise saturate and slow the evaporation rate, and replacing it with drier air that can absorb more moisture. Wind chill, the phenomenon that makes a winter day feel colder than the thermometer suggests, operates by the same mechanism applied to involuntary evaporation from exposed skin. Carry this principle indoors and apply it to a wet surface placed at a window where air moves through. The incoming air passes over the wet surface, picks up moisture, and in doing so absorbs the latent heat required to vaporize that moisture. The air arriving on the far side of the wet surface is cooler than the air that entered. Not dramatically cooler in the way that a refrigerated coil produces cold, but measurably cooler in the way that a damp cloth on a fevered forehead produces relief, which is to say, cooling that a thermometer confirms and a body notices. Human beings have been exploiting this principle in architecture for a very long time. The windcatcher towers of ancient Persia, structures that channeled prevailing winds down into buildings through shafts lined with wet clay or passed over underground water channels called qanats, cooled interior spaces by several degrees in climates where the outdoor air was both hot and dry. These were not primitive guesses at comfort. They were engineered responses to a thermal problem, built with a sophisticated understanding of airflow and evaporation that produced measurable results without a single moving mechanical part. The zeerpot, documented across North Africa and the Middle East for centuries, applies the same principle at the scale of a single container. A porous clay pot nested inside a larger clay pot with wet sand filling the gap between them keeps food cool through continuous evaporation from the outer pot's surface. In dry climates, a zeer pot can maintain internal temperatures more than 15 degrees Celsius below the ambient air temperature, which is sufficient to extend the edible life of vegetables and meat meaningfully in regions without mechanical refrigeration. Folk applications of evaporative cooling in American and European domestic history are numerous enough to suggest that this was once common knowledge rather than specialized knowledge. A wet sheet hung in a doorway on a hot afternoon cools the air moving through it by the same latent heat mechanism. A damp cloth draped over a butter crock keeps the contents from melting on a summer table. Cellars were positioned below grade, not only because the earth insulates against heat, but because the slight moisture in stone and soil walls provided continuous low level evaporative cooling to the air inside. These were not accidents of architecture. They were deliberate applications of an observed physical fact. The limitation of evaporative cooling, and Elias will state this plainly because it matters enormously for anyone attempting to predict their own results, is that it depends on the receiving air having room to accept more moisture. When the air is already heavily laden with humidity, as it frequently is in the American Southeast or in any coastal city in summer, the rate of evaporation from a wet surface slows dramatically because the air cannot easily accept additional water vapor. The cooling effect does not disappear entirely in humid conditions, but it shrinks to a fraction of what it produces in dry air. The meteorological concept that captures this limitation precisely is wet bulb temperature, which is the lowest temperature that evaporative cooling can theoretically push the air to under a given set of humidity conditions. The gap between the actual air temperature and the wet bulb temperature is exactly the cooling budget available. In Phoenix, Arizona, on a dry summer afternoon, that gap might be 20 degrees Fahrenheit or more, meaning evaporative cooling has substantial thermal work it can do. In New Orleans, Louisiana, in August, the wet bulb temperature may sit only 3 or 4 degrees below the actual air temperature, leaving a very narrow margin for evaporative effects to operate within. Elias in Lancaster County sits somewhere between those extremes, and on the driest summer afternoons, he measures a drop of 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit in the air passing through his coop vent system. On the most humid days, the drop is closer to 2 or 3 degrees. He records these figures not to impress anyone, but because a farmer whose animals depend on the system needs to know when it is doing most of its work and when it is doing less, so he can make other management decisions accordingly. The honest number is more useful than the impressive number, which is a principle that applies equally well to everything else he is about to explain. The evaporative function accounts for roughly half of what the tray does. The other half operates by a completely different mechanism, one that does not depend on humidity at all, one that works just as effectively in the wet air of a coastal city as in the dry air of the high plains, and one that the activated charcoal performs not because of what it does to the air chemically, but because of the extraordinary geometry of its internal structure at a scale invisible to the naked eye. The wet sheet in the doorway is not a memory of poverty. It is a memory of competence, and the distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Generations of American and European households understood, without formal instruction in thermodynamics, that a damp surface in the path of moving air produced a cooling effect that a dry surface did not, and they applied this understanding in a dozen practical contexts that have since been replaced by mechanical solutions carrying monthly operating costs and an eventual appointment with a landfill. A butter crock draped with a wet cloth on a summer table in a farmhouse kitchen in rural Pennsylvania was keeping its contents below the ambient air temperature through continuous evaporation from the cloth surface. The woman who placed that cloth there did not need to know the phrase latent heat of vaporization to know that the butter would be softer and less useful by evening if the cloth were removed. The knowledge lived in the practice, transmitted through observation and repetition across generations, and it was entirely accurate knowledge about a real physical phenomenon, expressed in the only language available to someone who had never sat in a university classroom. The milk safe, a ventilated wooden cabinet with mesh sides kept damp in warm weather, used the same principle to extend the life of dairy products before mechanical refrigeration reached rural areas. These were common fixtures in American farmhouses through the early 20th century, and their effectiveness was sufficient that families relied on them for food safety rather than mere convenience. A system that fails at food safety gets abandoned quickly. The milk safe persisted for generations because it worked, which is the most rigorous field trial a practical technology can undergo. Extend the lineage backward several thousand years and the engineering becomes more formal, but the principle remains identical. The windcatcher towers of ancient Persia, called badgirs in the Persian architectural tradition, were sophisticated structures that oriented multiple shaft openings toward prevailing winds from different directions, ensuring that at least one shaft was always receiving moving air regardless of wind direction. The air drawn down through the shaft passed over an underground water channel or a pool at the base of the tower before being distributed through the building. And the evaporative cooling at that wet surface dropped the interior temperature by enough to make a building habitable during summer heat that would otherwise make occupation unbearable. Cities in what is now Iran and Iraq relied on this technology for centuries, constructing towers that remain standing today as architectural evidence of a civilization that solved the summer heat problem without mechanical refrigeration, without electricity, and without a recurring supply cost beyond the water flowing through the qanat below the building. The qanat itself was an underground aqueduct system that moved water from mountain sources to desert settlements through gentle gravitational slope, requiring no pumps and no power. The combination of qanat and wind catcher was a complete passive cooling infrastructure serving entire cities, built from stone and clay and an accurate understanding of airflow and evaporation. Just imagine standing in the ground floor of a Persian house in the city of Yazd in the month of July, where the outdoor temperature sits above 40 degrees Celsius, and feeling air that has been cooled by the wind catcher in the water channel below arrive at the interior of the building at a temperature that permits rest and work. This was not a luxury available only to the wealthy. The wind catcher was a standard architectural feature of ordinary residential buildings in hot climate Persian cities, which means the cooling of interior air through evaporation was considered a basic requirement of habitable construction rather than an amenity. The zir pot brings the scale back down to the individual and the household. A porous clay inner pot surrounded by wet sand inside a larger clay pot, with a wet cloth over the top, keeps interior temperatures sufficiently cool through continuous surface evaporation to preserve vegetables and cooked food for multiple days in ambient temperatures that would otherwise spoil them within hours. Development organizations working in sub-Saharan Africa reintroduced the zir pot in communities without electricity access in the early 2000s, and documented temperature differentials of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius between the interior of the pot and the surrounding air on dry days, which is a performance figure that most small mechanical refrigerators would not exceed by a substantial margin. The thread connecting the zir pot to the wind catcher tower to the damp butter cloth to Elias Yoder's tray in Lancaster County is not metaphorical. It is the same physical transaction every time. Water evaporating from a surface, absorbing latent heat from the surrounding air, lowering the temperature of that air by a measurable amount that varies with local humidity but is always present to some degree. The technology did not evolve from primitive to sophisticated across this lineage. It was sophisticated at every stage in exactly the ways that mattered for the problem being solved with the materials available. What changed was not the physics but the economics. Mechanical refrigeration and air conditioning arrived in the 20th century, carrying capital costs that put them out of reach for most households initially, then dropped in price as manufacturing scaled, and eventually became so normalized that the passive alternatives they displaced stopped being transmitted as practical knowledge and became instead historical curiosities. The wet sheet in the doorway became a detail in a period novel rather than an instruction in a household manual. The buttercloth became a charming anachronism rather than a functional tool. Elias's tray is a direct reclamation of that displaced knowledge, applied with a material that adds the second function, the air-cleaning function, that the wet sheet and the buttercloth did not provide. The damp surface that cools the incoming air is simultaneously the surface that captures the compounds making that air unpleasant or harmful. And the reason it can do both at once is entirely a consequence of the microscopic geometry of the material it is made from, a geometry so extreme in its dimensions that the number describing it strains ordinary intuition even when stated accurately. That geometry is the subject of what comes next, and it is the part of the explanation that converts the tray from a piece of folk wisdom into something that a materials scientist and a livestock farmer can discuss in the same terms, because the physical structure doing the work is the same, whether the person examining it holds a doctorate or a pitchfork. Pick up a single granule of activated charcoal and hold it between two fingers. It is roughly the size of a small pea, dark gray to black, slightly rough on the surface and light enough that a handful of them feels less dense than the same volume of gravel or soil. Nothing about its appearance suggests that it is doing anything unusual. It looks, to be direct about it, like a small piece of burned material, which is approximately what it is in terms of its origin, though what has been done to it since the burning is the part that transforms it from ash into one of the most geometrically extraordinary substances available at a consumer price point. The interior of that granule is not solid, it is a labyrinth. The manufacturing process that produces activated charcoal begins with a carbon-rich source material, commonly coconut shell, wood, or coal, and subjects it to high-temperature processing in a low-oxygen environment, followed by activation through steam or chemical treatment. This activation step does not simply create pores in the material the way a sponge has visible holes. It creates a branching network of channels at 3 distinct scales: macropores, mesopores, and micropores, each category smaller than the last, penetrating every cubic millimeter of the granule's interior to produce a total internal surface area that makes the external surface of the granule essentially irrelevant by comparison. The number that results from measuring this internal surface is the one that strains intuition. A single gram of activated carbon, a quantity that sits comfortably on a fingertip, presents a surface area in the range of 500 to 1,500 square meters, depending on the grade and the activation method used. A standard tennis court covers approximately 260 square meters. 1 gram of this material, held in a closed hand, contains the folded equivalent of between 2 and 6 tennis courts of surface, compressed into a space smaller than a sugar cube. A shallow tray holding 1 kilogram of activated charcoal, which is approximately what Elias spreads in his coupe vent frame, contains a surface area measured in the hundreds of thousands of square meters. That number is not offered as spectacle. It is offered as the explanation for everything the material does. Both functions of Elias's tray, the evaporative cooling and the adsorption of airborne compounds, are direct consequences of this surface area. A material with this much internal surface can hold a remarkable quantity of water within its pore structure, water that then evaporates gradually into passing air rather than draining immediately to the bottom of the tray. This is the mechanism that makes the tray function as an evaporative cooler rather than simply as a wet surface that dries out in minutes. The water is held distributed throughout the granule's interior, released slowly as the surface-adjacent water evaporates, and capillary forces draw deeper water toward the surface to replace it. At the same time, and through the same pore surfaces, the material captures molecules from the air passing through it. This capture is not a chemical reaction in the sense of molecules being broken down or transformed. It is a physical adhesion, a phenomenon called adsorption, where molecules in the passing airstream contact the pore walls and adhere to them through weak surface forces of the kind that operate at the molecular scale, sometimes described as van der Waals forces in physical chemistry. The molecule lands on the pore wall and stays there, held by surface attraction, while the air that carried it continues through the tray and into the room. The distinction between adsorption and absorption is worth one careful sentence because people encounter the word and assume they know it. Absorption is what a sponge does with water. The water enters the bulk of the material and is held within it. Adsorption is what activated charcoal does with airborne molecules. The molecules adhere to the surface of the material rather than being taken into its bulk. The surface is the active ingredient, which is precisely why surface area is the critical variable, and why a material with 500 square meters of surface per gram can capture a remarkable quantity of molecules before reaching saturation. The molecules that adhere most readily to activated charcoal surfaces are the ones responsible for the air quality problems in the co-op and the closed bedroom. Ammonia binds effectively to activated carbon surfaces. Volatile organic compounds, the class of airborne molecules that produce the stuffy, chemical quality of poorly ventilated indoor air, are captured efficiently. Hydrogen sulfide, the compound responsible for the sulfurous quality of animal housing, adsorbs readily. The material does not discriminate in favor of particular molecules based on their harmfulness to humans. It captures based on molecular size, polarity, and the surface chemistry of the pore walls, which happens to produce strong affinity for most of the compounds that make enclosed animal and human spaces unpleasant or harmful. Consider what this means for the air passing through Elias's coop vent. The incoming air, carrying heat, ammonia, and volatile compounds from the birds and the decomposing litter on the coop floor, enters the tray through the wire mesh face of the wooden frame. It passes through the bed of wet activated charcoal granules. Water evaporating from the granule surfaces absorbs latent heat from the air, reducing its temperature. Simultaneously, the ammonia and volatile compounds in the airstream contact the vast internal surface of the granules and adhere to the pore walls. The air that exits the far side of the tray is cooler than the air that entered, and it carries a substantially reduced load of the compounds that were making the coop harmful and unpleasant. Two separate problems, each of which the industry sells a separate product to address, are being resolved simultaneously by one physical process occurring across one surface in one shallow tray. The surface area is the reason this is possible. Without that extraordinary geometry, the charcoal would be inert black granules and the water would be a puddle. With it, the combination becomes a passive air treatment system that has no moving parts, requires no electricity, and costs $7 to assemble from materials available at any pet supply store. However, before the tray can be built and placed and put to work, one material distinction must be made with complete clarity, because the mistake of using the wrong material does not produce a system that merely fails to work. It produces a system that actively endangers the animals and people it is supposed to help. And that danger has a specific chemical origin that any viewer can verify independently in about 30 seconds of reading the ingredient list on the bag they are considering purchasing. The word adsorption appears in the documentation of nearly every industrial air filtration system built in the last 100 years, and it is almost universally skipped over by the people reading that documentation because it looks enough like absorption that the brain files it under already understood and moves on. This is the kind of small lexical confusion that costs nothing in a casual reading, and costs considerably more when a person is trying to understand why a material works the way it does and whether they can trust it to keep doing so. Absorption is what happens when you drop a paper towel on a spill. The liquid enters the bulk of the towel material, distributed through its fibers, held inside rather than on the surface. The towel is heavier after absorption because the liquid is now part of its mass in a distributed sense. When the towel is full, it is full throughout, and squeezing it expels the liquid that was held inside. This is the model most people carry when they hear any word ending in sorption, and it leads them to imagine activated charcoal as a kind of sponge that fills with captured molecules the way a towel fills with water, becoming uniformly saturated and then releasing everything when squeezed or heated. Adsorption works differently in a way that matters practically. The captured molecules do not enter the bulk of the charcoal granule. They land on the surface of the pore walls and adhere there, held by the same category of weak attractive forces that cause molecules to prefer a surface to open air when the surface chemistry is compatible with their own molecular structure. The granule's interior is not filled the way a sponge fills with liquid. It is coated progressively as more molecules arrive and find available surface to adhere to, working their way deeper into the pore network as the outer surfaces approach saturation. This distinction is the reason activated charcoal can be regenerated rather than simply discarded when its capacity is reached. Because the molecules are held on the surface by physical attraction rather than chemical bonds, applying sufficient energy in the form of heat from direct sunlight or a low oven breaks that surface attraction and drives the molecules off the pore walls and back into the air, leaving the surface clean and available for new capture. The charcoal is not chemically altered by adsorption. It is temporarily occupied, and the occupants can be evicted by heat, after which the surface is restored to essentially its original capacity. Here is the thing that makes this regeneration fact more than a convenience for the person maintaining the tray. It is also the explanation for why the surface forces involved in adsorption are selective in a particular way. The molecules that adhere most strongly to activated charcoal surfaces are the ones with higher molecular weight and greater polarity, which happen to include most of the volatile organic compounds, ammonia derivatives, and odor-causing molecules that constitute the air quality problem in a co-op or a closed room. Smaller, lighter molecules like nitrogen, oxygen, and the primary components of clean air pass through the pore network without adhering strongly, which means the tray preferentially captures the problematic components while allowing the breathable components to pass. The air coming out of Elias's tray is not merely air that has traveled through a bed of black granules. It is air from which a specific class of molecules has been selectively removed by a process grounded in the same surface physics that industrial chemical engineers exploit in large-scale gas purification systems worth millions of dollars. The tray in the barn and the industrial adsorption column in a chemical processing plant are operating by identical principles at wildly different scales. And the difference in scale is entirely a function of the volume of air being treated rather than any fundamental difference in the mechanism. Extend this understanding to the sick room and the closed bedroom, and the application becomes immediately legible. The volatile organic compounds that accumulate in poorly ventilated indoor spaces, released by furniture, adhesives, cleaning products, and the occupants themselves, are precisely the class of molecule that activated charcoal captures most efficiently. The stuffy quality of a sealed room on a hot night is not simply a temperature problem or a carbon dioxide problem, though both of those contribute. It is also a volatile compound problem, and the tray addresses that component of air quality through the same adsorptive mechanism it uses in the co-op. Just imagine placing a tray of wet-activated charcoal at the bedroom window on a July night, and lying down to sleep with the assurance that the air moving through that window is being cooled by evaporation and stripped of volatile compounds by adsorption before it reaches the pillow. The system running this process has no motor, produces no noise, consumes no electricity, and requires nothing from you during the night beyond the presence of a light breeze at the window. This is not an approximation of what a $300 purifier does. It is a replication of the core function of that purifier's most important component, delivered without the housing, the fan, the digital display, or the subscription for replacement cartridges. The adsorption function does have a ceiling, and Elias will state it plainly. The tray cannot capture everything in the air. Very small molecules, gases with low molecular weight, and some highly reactive compounds move through the pore network without adhering in useful quantities. The system is not a substitute for clinical-grade air treatment in a medical context, and it makes no claim to be. What it captures genuinely and in meaningful quantities. What it does not capture, it does not pretend to. This honest accounting of function and limitation is what separates a tool from a fraud, and it is the accounting Elias insists on before the build instructions begin. The physical principle is now established in full. Moving air passes over a wet, highly porous surface. Evaporation cools the air. Adsorption cleans it. Two jobs from one surface, powered by the same extraordinary geometry that makes the material look unremarkable in the hand and perform remarkably in the tray. What remains before the build can begin is one critical distinction about materials, the one that stands between a functioning system and a dangerous one, and it is a distinction that can be verified by reading two ingredient labels side by side for about 30 seconds. The activated carbon filter inside a residential air purifier does not represent a technological advancement over the loose granular material in the aquarium aisle. It represents a packaging decision. Someone took the same material, bonded it to a substrate, enclosed it in a plastic frame, assigned it a model number, and built a replacement schedule around it that generates predictable quarterly revenue. The carbon performing the adsorption is chemically and structurally identical to what Elias spreads in his tray, and understanding this identity is not a cynical observation about the appliance industry, but a straightforward material fact that any buyer can verify by reading the product specifications on both packages simultaneously. Walk through the filtration section of any large American home improvement retailer and examine the replacement cartridges for the major purifier brands. The active filtration media listed on the label will include in nearly every unit above the entry price point either activated carbon or activated charcoal, sometimes specified as coconut shell carbon or coal-based carbon depending on the source material used in manufacturing. The gram weight of carbon in a standard residential replacement cartridge typically falls between 50 and 150 grams, bonded in a thin layer across the cartridge face. A standard bag of aquarium-activated carbon contains between 100 and 450 grams of loose granular material at $5 to $8, which means the raw material cost of a replacement cartridge, stripped of its plastic housing and replacement schedule marketing, is a fraction of the $12 to $60 that cartridge retails for. The bonded layer design of a filter cartridge is an engineering compromise rather than an optimization. Bonding the carbon to a flat substrate makes it easy to install and replace without loose material entering the airstream, which is a legitimate practical concern for a consumer product. However, the bonding process partially occludes some pore openings and reduces the available surface area per gram compared to loose granular carbon in a bed configuration. A loose bed of activated charcoal through which air passes slowly presents more of its total surface area to the airstream than a thin, bonded layer through which air passes quickly, which means Elias's tray, all other things being equal, is not a degraded version of the commercial filter. It is in some respects a more thorough one. Beyond that, the commercial purifier separates the cooling function from the filtration function entirely. The fan inside the purifier moves air through the carbon filter, but the housing is sealed and the air exiting the unit is the same temperature as the air entering it, because no evaporative cooling is taking place. The purifier treats air quality without addressing thermal comfort, which is why households that purchase one for summer use frequently find themselves running both the purifier and a separate air conditioner simultaneously. Two machines performing two jobs that one tray of wet activated charcoal performs together. The combined purchase and operating cost of those two machines over a single summer season can exceed $300. The tray costs $7. The historical record of carbon-based air filtration reaching back to the First World War clarifies something important about the commercial framing of this technology. When the chemist James Burt Garner developed activated charcoal gas mask filters in 1915, the goal was survival under chemical attack, not comfort or consumer appeal. The filtration had to work, or the soldier wearing the mask did not survive the engagement. There was no room in that context for marketing claims that exceeded actual performance, no subscription model to optimize, no replacement schedule calibrated to revenue rather than genuine material exhaustion. The carbon worked because its physical properties demanded that it work, and the performance standard was set by the harshest possible real-world test. That same material, meeting that same performance standard, now sits in the aquarium aisle at a consumer price because the aquarium hobby requires it for water chemistry management and has created a stable supply chain for it at commodity pricing. The air purification industry sources from the same supply chain, adds manufacturing steps for bonding and cartridge formation, packages the result in branded housing, and sells the assembly at a price that reflects the brand, the housing, the marketing, and the replacement revenue model rather than the underlying material cost. This is not concealment. It is simply how consumer product pricing works, and it operates in plain sight for anyone who looks at two labels at once. What's more, the aquarium-grade material carries a performance verification that the residential filter cartridge does not always provide explicitly. Aquarium keepers are an exacting community when it comes to water chemistry, because the consequences of inadequate filtration are immediate and visible in the form of sick or deceased fish. The activated carbon sold for aquarium use is tested against specific chemical removal benchmarks, and the hobby community generates substantial independent documentation of which products perform as labeled and which do not, documentation available in forum archives and hobbyist review sites that collectively represent one of the more rigorous consumer testing records available for any commodity product. Elias did not arrive at aquarium carbon through a scientific literature search. He arrived at it because a neighbor who kept fish mentioned that the material stripped odors from tank water the way nothing else did, and Elias recognized immediately that the odor problem in his coop and the odor problem in a fish tank were the same class of problem approached from different directions. The neighbor's fish tank needed the volatile compounds removed from the water. The coop needed them removed from the air. The carbon did not care which fluid it was treating. It absorbed from both with equal indifference to the application. And when Elias wet the charcoal in a tray and placed it at the coop vent, the evaporative cooling function appeared as a bonus he had not specifically anticipated, a consequence of the same surface area that was producing the adsorption. The dual function was not designed. It was discovered by a farmer who was trying to solve one problem and found that the material he chose solved two simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of discovery that happens when a person understands a physical principle well enough to recognize its consequences when they appear unexpectedly. Elias calls this finding out what something actually does rather than what you hired it for, and he considers it one of the more reliable sources of practical knowledge available to a person who pays close attention to materials and their behavior. However, the identity between aquarium carbon and purifier carbon carries one important boundary condition that must be stated before the build instructions begin, because the category of material called charcoal contains members that share the name but not the properties. And placing the wrong member of that category in a tray at a coop vent or a bedroom window does not produce a degraded version of the desired result. It produces a system that introduces compounds into the breathing air of animals and people that have no business being there. And the specific chemistry of why this is true is the subject that must be addressed completely before a single dollar is spent at the hardware store. The bag of charcoal briquettes sitting on the shelf, 2 aisles over from the aquarium carbon shares, one word with the material Elias uses and almost nothing else. Both are called charcoal. Both are black. Both derive ultimately from the thermal processing of carbon-rich organic material. Lump hardwood charcoal, sold as an alternative to briquettes for grilling and distinguishable by its irregular shape and absence of uniform compression, is a closer relative of activated carbon than the briquette, but still falls short of what the application requires. Lump charcoal has undergone the initial thermal processing that creates the carbon structure, but it has not undergone the activation step that develops the micropore network responsible for the high surface area. Its adsorptive capacity per gram is substantially lower than activated carbon, and while it contains fewer problematic additives than briquettes, it also delivers a fraction of the performance. Using lump charcoal in the tray produces a system that looks correct and performs inadequately, which is in some ways a more dangerous outcome than one that fails obviously, because the builder may conclude that the principle does not work when the actual failure was a material substitution. The verification process for purchasing the correct material takes about 30 seconds and requires reading the label of whatever product is under consideration. The words activated carbon or activated charcoal should appear as the primary or sole ingredient. The package should specify aquarium, horticultural, or air filtration use, any of which confirms that the material has undergone activation processing. The package should not contain any reference to use as a fuel, should not list sodium nitrate, starch binders, limestone, or accelerants among its ingredients, and should not carry instructions for ignition. If the package includes instructions for lighting the product on fire, it is the wrong product regardless of what the word charcoal on the front of the bag might suggest. Here is the thing that makes this distinction particularly important for co-op applications. Birds are substantially more sensitive to airborne chemical compounds than humans are, which is the biological basis for the historical use of canaries as early warning systems in coal mines during the 19th and early 20th centuries. A compound present at a concentration that produces mild discomfort in a human adult can produce serious respiratory distress in a chicken at the same concentration, because avian respiratory physiology processes air more efficiently, and therefore delivers airborne compounds to sensitive tissues more completely than mammalian respiratory systems do. Introducing briquette off-gassing into a coop does not produce the same outcome in a bird as it would in a person standing in the same space. It produces a worse one. The safety profile of genuine activated aquarium carbon in this application is well established through decades of use in enclosed aquarium systems, where the water in contact with the carbon is the same water fish breathe through their gills. If activated carbon at aquarium grade introduced harmful compounds into the water, The aquarium hobby would have abandoned it within its first decade of adoption. Instead, it has remained the standard chemical filtration medium in the hobby for more than 50 years, which constitutes a field trial of a scope and duration that few materials can match. The fish are the canary in this particular mine, and they have been reporting acceptable results continuously since the 1970s. At the same time, even genuine activated charcoal carries one condition of use that must be respected absolutely. A condition that has nothing to do with the material's chemistry and everything to do with the physics of what a highly porous carbon surface does to the gas composition of a sealed, enclosed space. This condition is the one real safety rule that Elias said he would not skip over, and it is the one that converts an otherwise forgiving and low-risk system into a genuine hazard when the single required precaution is ignored. The precaution is simple, it is non-negotiable, and it needs to be understood completely before anyone places a tray of activated charcoal anywhere near a space where breathing is expected to continue uninterrupted through the night. The purchase takes less time than the explanation. Walk into any store that sells supplies for keeping fish, which in practical terms means any large pet supply retailer, any farm supply store with an aquarium section, and the majority of general merchandise stores that carry a sporting goods or outdoor living department, and locate the aquarium filtration aisle. The activated carbon will be on the shelf in one of 3 forms, and all 3 are suitable for Elias's application, though they differ slightly in handling convenience and cost per gram. The first form is loose granular carbon in a sealed plastic bag or tub. This is typically the most economical option per gram and the most flexible for the tray application, because the granules can be spread to any desired depth without needing to be removed from a preformed container. Bag sizes range from roughly 100 grams at the small end to 450 grams or more for the larger economy packages, and the price across this range generally falls between $5 for a small bag and $8 for the larger quantity. The larger bag is the better value for anyone building a co-op vent frame of meaningful size, and any excess material stores indefinitely in a sealed container in a cool, dry location without degrading. The second form is activated carbon preloaded into a mesh bag or filter sock designed for insertion into an aquarium filter housing. These work perfectly well in the tray application and have the minor advantage of containing the granules without loose material migrating around the tray surface, which some builders find easier to manage during daily re-wetting. The disadvantage is that the mesh bag format costs slightly more per gram than loose carbon and limits the ability to spread the material in a thin uniform layer, which is the configuration that maximizes the surface area presented to passing airflow. For a permanent installation in a co-op vent frame, loose granular carbon spread and leveled by hand is the more practical choice. The third form is activated carbon bonded to a filter pad, a flat fibrous panel with carbon granules embedded in the fiber matrix, sold for use in both aquarium and small appliance filtration. This format is the least suitable for Elias's tray application because the bonding reduces available surface area per gram and the flat pad configuration does not hold water through its depth the way a granular bed does, limiting the evaporative cooling function. Filter pads are useful in their intended application and should be passed over in favor of loose granular material when building the tray system. Horticultural activated charcoal is the second major retail source and deserves specific mention because it is stocked in garden centers and plant supply sections rather than the aquarium aisle, making it accessible to buyers who do not have a large pet supply store nearby. Sold primarily for use in potted plant drainage layers and terrarium construction, horticultural activated charcoal is the same fundamental material as aquarium carbon and performs identically in the tray application. The particle size in horticultural grades tends to be slightly larger and more irregular than aquarium carbon, which has no meaningful effect on adsorptive performance, but may affect how evenly the material spreads in a shallow tray. Package sizes and pricing are comparable to aquarium grades, typically falling in the $5 to $8 range for quantities sufficient to fill 1 or 2 tray applications. Beyond those 2 sources, activated charcoal for air filtration is also sold directly as a home filtration medium in some hardware stores and online retailers, sometimes labeled as air purifier refill carbon or bulk filter carbon. These products are functionally identical to aquarium and horticultural grades and are sometimes available in larger quantities at lower per gram cost, which makes them worth considering for anyone building multiple installations or planning a larger coop vent frame. The label verification process described in the previous section applies equally here. Confirm activated carbon or activated charcoal as the sole or primary ingredient. Confirm the absence of binders, oxidizers, and fuel use instructions, and the product is suitable regardless of which section of the store it came from. Online purchasing deserves a mention for buyers in rural areas where the nearest farm supply or pet store involves a significant drive. Standard aquarium activated carbon ships without hazardous material restrictions, stores without special conditions, and is available from multiple sellers at prices comparable to or below retail store pricing when purchased in quantities of 450 grams or more. The material does not degrade during shipping or storage as long as it is kept dry before use, and a sealed bag purchased online and stored in a cool location retains its full adsorptive capacity for the duration of a growing season and beyond. One purchasing note that Elias offers from experience: the brand matters less than the grade specification. Premium aquarium carbon brands marketed for sensitive reef tank applications carry price premiums that reflect their higher surface area per gram and tighter particle size distribution, properties that matter considerably for the water chemistry of a coral reef aquarium and matter much less for a coop vent tray where the performance requirements are less demanding. Standard freshwater aquarium carbon at the lower end of the price range performs the dual cooling and adsorption function fully adequately, and spending 3 times as much for reef-grade material produces no meaningful improvement in tray performance. The $5 to $8 range covers everything needed. The total material cost of a functional tray system, including the activated carbon, and assuming the builder has access to any shallow container, a baking dish, a seed tray, an old roasting pan, or a scrap wood frame of their own construction, is the price of 1 bag of carbon. The container itself costs nothing if sourced from items already present in any household or farm. The water costs nothing beyond whatever the local supply charges per gallon, which for the daily re-wetting of a single tray amounts to a quantity so small it does not register on a monthly water bill. The total ongoing cost after the initial purchase is the cost of regenerating or eventually replacing the carbon, which on Elias's maintenance schedule of monthly sun regeneration means a single bag lasts through most of a summer before replacement is warranted. The purchase, in other words, is a one-time event followed by a maintenance schedule that costs nothing and takes 2 minutes each morning. The build that follows that purchase takes 15 minutes and requires no tools beyond whatever is needed to construct the chosen container, which, for the simplest version, requires nothing at all beyond the tray and the material. Everything required to understand the build correctly is now in place, and the build itself begins at the window, which is the only place in the room where placing the tray produces the full dual function rather than a partial version of it. The build begins with a container, and the container can be almost anything that holds a shallow layer of material without leaking onto whatever surface it rests on. Elias uses a wooden frame with wire mesh stapled across one face for his permanent coop installation, but the functional principle operates equally well in a disposable aluminum roasting pan, a ceramic baking dish, a plastic seed tray from the garden center, or a shallow wooden box lined with a single layer of window screen. The container is not the active component. The carbon is the active component, and the container's only job is to hold the carbon in a layer of the right depth at the right location. Depth matters more than surface area within the practical range available to most builders. Elias spreads his carbon to a depth of between 1 inch and 2 inches, which represents the range that balances 2 competing requirements. A layer thinner than 1 inch dries out too quickly in warm conditions, requiring re-wetting more than once per day, and reducing the continuous evaporative cooling the system provides during the hours between morning maintenance and evening. A layer deeper than 2 inches begins to restrict airflow through the bed, increasing the resistance that incoming air must overcome, and reducing the volume of air the system treats per hour, which matters more in a coop vent application where the goal is conditioning the full air change volume of the building rather than merely treating a small fraction of it. Spread the carbon evenly across the tray surface and level it by hand or with a flat edge. Uniformity of depth across the tray surface is more important than achieving a precise measurement, because an uneven layer creates preferential flow paths where incoming air takes the route of least resistance through the shallower sections, bypassing the deeper sections and reducing the effective contact time between the air and the carbon surface. A level, even layer ensures that air moving through the bed contacts the carbon surface uniformly across the full tray width, maximizing both the evaporative cooling surface and the adsorption surface available to each unit of passing air. Wetting the carbon is the step that activates the evaporative cooling function, and the wetting method affects how the system performs in the first hour after setup. Pour clean water slowly and evenly over the spread carbon surface, distributing the water across the full tray area rather than pouring it into a single point, which would saturate the carbon beneath the pour point while leaving the surrounding material dry. Continue pouring until the carbon is visibly wet throughout, and a small amount of water begins to appear at the bottom of the tray. At that point, stop pouring and allow the tray to rest for approximately 2 minutes while the water distributes through the pore network of the granules by capillary action. After the 2-minute wait, tilt the tray gently and pour off the freestanding water that has collected at the bottom. This step is the one that most first-time builders skip, and skipping it matters. Freestanding water at the bottom of the tray does not contribute to evaporative cooling because it is not in contact with moving air. It contributes dead weight, reduces airflow through the bed by partially flooding the lower pore spaces of the carbon granules, and in warm conditions can begin to support microbial growth within a day or two that the properly managed damp but not waterlogged carbon would not sustain. The correctly prepared tray should feel thoroughly damp when a handful of carbon is pressed lightly in the palm, releasing no free liquid but leaving the hand noticeably wet. The distinction between damp and waterlogged is the operational standard Elias returns to every morning during the daily re-wetting maintenance. The goal is carbon that holds enough water in its pore structure to sustain continuous evaporation throughout the day, without the airstream drying it completely before evening, while remaining free of standing water that would restrict airflow and invite biological problems. In hot, dry conditions where evaporation is rapid, re-wetting once per day in the morning is usually sufficient. In cooler or more humid conditions where evaporation is slower, the carbon may remain adequately moist through a second day, though Elias re-wets daily regardless of conditions because the 2-minute maintenance operation costs less than the diagnostic effort of determining whether the carbon needs it on a given morning. The container, once filled, wetted, and drained to the damp standard, weighs noticeably more than the dry carbon alone, which is relevant for anyone building a wall-mounted or vent frame installation that needs to support the loaded weight. A tray containing 1 kilogram of dry activated carbon, wetted to the damp standard, holds an additional 300 to 500 grams of water distributed through the pore structure, bringing the total loaded weight to between 1.5 and 2 kilograms for a single tray installation. This is light enough to be supported by a simple ledge or frame construction using scrap lumber, but heavy enough that a loosely fitted installation can shift unexpectedly and should be secured against movement before the tray is left unattended. The assembled tray in this state is a complete functional system requiring only placement and airflow to begin performing both jobs. It will begin cooling passing air immediately upon placement at an air intake where air movement exists, because the evaporative process begins the moment dry air contacts the wet carbon surface. The adsorption function begins simultaneously, as airborne molecules in the incoming airstream contact the carbon surface and adhere. Neither function requires a warm-up period, an initial calibration, or any action beyond placement in the path of moving air. As a result, the interval between completing the build and experiencing measurable results is essentially zero, which is an unusual feature for a system of this capability, and one that Elias finds consistently surprises people who have spent years waiting for mechanical systems to cycle through startup sequences before beginning to condition air. The tray does not start up. It simply is, from the moment it is placed, an air treatment surface doing two jobs quietly and without requiring anything further from the person who built it. What it requires is placement, and placement is the decision that separates a tray that performs well from a tray that performs at a fraction of its potential. The location within the space where the tray is placed determines whether it treats all of the air entering the space or only the air that happens to drift past it by convection. And the difference between those two outcomes is large enough that Elias considers placement the single most important variable in the entire system, more important than the depth of the carbon layer, more important than the wetting method, more important than any refinement to the container design. A perfectly built tray in the wrong location is a wasted $7. The same tray at the intake is the whole system working as intended. The middle of the room is the wrong place. This seems like an obvious statement until you consider that the majority of commercially sold air purifiers are designed to sit in the middle of a room, drawing air toward themselves from all directions and returning treated air to the general space, which is precisely the placement logic that makes them less efficient than they could be and creates the market for larger, more powerful, and more expensive units to compensate for the inefficiency. A device that treats air by drawing it from the room and returning it to the room is working against the natural air movement of a ventilated space, and the energy it expends doing so is the electricity bill that arrives every month. Placement at the intake means placing the tray at the point where outdoor air enters the space before it has mixed with the interior air volume. At a window, this means sitting the tray on the sill or in the window opening itself, oriented so that incoming air must pass through the carbon bed before entering the room. At a cope vent, it means mounting the tray or the wooden frame across the vent opening so that every cubic foot of air entering the building passes through the carbon layer. At a doorway used for ventilation, it means positioning the tray in the lower portion of the opening where cooler, denser incoming air tends to flow while warmer interior air exits through the upper portion of the same opening. The building science principle underlying this placement instruction is straightforward and applies to any ventilated space from a single bedroom to a large agricultural building. When a naturally ventilated space undergoes a complete air change, the volume of interior air is replaced by an equal volume of outdoor air entering through the intake openings. In a well-ventilated coop designed to the standards recommended by poultry extension services, this air change can occur many times per hour during warm weather when vent openings are fully open and a breeze is present. Every one of those complete air changes represents a volume of air that, if the intake is treated, passes through the conditioning surface before entering the space. A tray, placed in the center of a room, treats only the air that drifts past it by convection, or by the weak air currents generated by occupant movement. Just imagine the difference between a bedroom where the air arriving at the pillow has been cooled by evaporation and stripped of volatile compounds at the window, and one where untreated outdoor air enters freely, while a purifier in the corner processes a fraction of the total air volume in circulation. The first room's air treatment is comprehensive by placement. The second room's treatment is partial by design, a limitation that the purifier's specifications do not advertise and that most buyers do not discover until they have lived with the machine through a full summer and notice that the air in the far corner of the room remains stuffy, regardless of how long the purifier runs. What's more, intake placement means the tray is never fighting the room's air circulation patterns. It is working with them, inserted at the point where outdoor air commits to entering the space, before it has diluted itself in the interior volume and become difficult to intercept. The physics of ventilation do the work of delivering air to the treatment surface. The tray does not need to generate its own airflow to function, though adding airflow improves performance in still conditions, and the addition of even the smallest fan transforms a weather-dependent system into a reliable one that performs on the same schedule regardless of whether the afternoon brings a breeze or the still, heavy air of a genuine heat wave. That still, heavy air is exactly the condition that most tests a passive ventilation system, and it is the condition for which the addition of a small, low-power fan is most justified. The fan does not need to be large. It does not need to be fast. It needs only to move enough air through the carbon bed to sustain a measurable evaporation rate and ensure that the airstream contacts the full depth of the carbon layer rather than trickling through the surface and bypassing the lower pore network. Even a fan, drawing a few watts of power, running on a small solar panel mounted outside the window, is sufficient to maintain this minimum airflow through the hottest and stillest afternoons of the year. Still, air is the enemy of both functions the tray performs. Evaporation requires a supply of unsaturated air moving across the wet surface to carry away the moisture-laden air that accumulates directly above it. Because if that humid boundary layer is not removed and replaced with drier air, the evaporation rate drops towards zero regardless of how wet the carbon surface remains. Adsorption requires airflow through the bed to deliver molecules to the pore surfaces. Because a molecule suspended in still air has no mechanism to reach the carbon surface except the slow process of molecular diffusion, which operates at a rate far too low to treat a meaningful volume of air per hour. Both functions, in other words, scale directly with the volume of air moving through the carbon bed per unit of time. A natural cross breeze is the ideal driving force for this airflow, requiring no hardware, no power supply, and no maintenance beyond keeping the intake and exhaust openings of the space unobstructed. In a building oriented and designed to capture prevailing winds, a cross breeze moves air from the upwind intake opening to the downwind exhaust opening continuously during daylight hours when wind is present, passing through the carbon tray at the intake with enough velocity to sustain both evaporative cooling and adsorption at their full design performance. Elias's farmhouse and his co-ops are oriented to capture the prevailing southwest afternoon breeze in Lancaster County, a siting decision his great-grandfather made when building the original structures, and one that Elias considers one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure on the property, because it costs nothing to run and never breaks down. The practical reality for most people attempting this system is that natural cross-ventilation is available sometimes, but not always, and the times when it is least available tend to coincide with the times when it is most needed. The still, hot, humid afternoons of a genuine heat wave are precisely the conditions that produce the greatest heat stress in poultry and the greatest discomfort in sleeping rooms, and they are also the conditions under which natural ventilation slows or stops entirely. A system that depends exclusively on wind performs well on the days when it matters least and poorly on the days when it matters most, which is a reliability profile that justifies a small mechanical supplement even in locations with generally good natural ventilation. The solar fan is the supplement Elias recommends, and the specific reason he specifies solar rather than grid-connected is consistent with his broader approach to tools. A solar fan requires no wiring, no connection to the household electrical system, no ongoing electricity cost, and no dependence on a utility provider. A small panel of between 5 and 20 watts, the kind sold for charging portable devices or running garden ventilation systems, is sufficient to drive a low-voltage fan of the size needed to move air through a single tray installation. The panel mounts outside the window or on the coop roof. The fan mounts above or beside the tray at the intake, and the system begins operating whenever sufficient sunlight strikes the panel, which is to say, it runs hardest during the brightest and hottest part of the day exactly when the cooling function is most needed. The pairing of solar panel and small fan creates a self-regulating thermal response that no thermostat or electronic controller is required to manage. On a cool, overcast morning, the panel produces little power. The fan runs slowly or not at all, and the natural convection of the space handles air movement adequately without mechanical assistance. On a bright, hot afternoon when the sun is directly overhead and the coop or bedroom is accumulating heat most rapidly, the panel is at peak output, the fan runs at maximum speed, and the airflow through the carbon bed is at its highest rate precisely when the evaporative cooling and adsorption functions are most needed. The system intensifies its own operation in response to the same sunlight that is creating the heat problem, without any electronic intervention. A fan suitable for this application does not need to generate high air velocity through the tray. What it needs to generate is sufficient airflow to prevent the humid boundary layer from forming above the wet carbon surface, and to ensure that incoming air contacts the full depth of the carbon bed rather than skimming across the surface. A gentle, steady movement of air through the tray, comparable to the airflow produced by a moderate natural breeze, is entirely adequate. Small 12-volt direct current fans designed for computer cooling or small appliance ventilation are often suitable for this application and are available from electronic suppliers and online retailers at prices between $5 and $15, bringing the total system cost, including the fan and a small solar panel, to somewhere between $25 and $40 for a complete, self-powered, continuously operating installation. Even without the solar fan, the system is not helpless in still conditions. The temperature differential between indoor and outdoor air that develops during a heat wave creates a natural convection current through any opening between the two environments, with cooler outdoor air tending to flow inward along the lower portion of the opening while warmer interior air exits along the upper portion. This convective flow is gentle and slow compared to wind-driven ventilation, but it is continuous and predictable, and a tray positioned in the lower portion of the opening where the convective inflow is concentrated will receive a steady, if modest airflow, even on the stillest afternoons. The fan converts this modest passive performance into a reliable active one, which is the upgrade that Elias added to his coupe installation after the second summer of operating the basic tray version. Here's the thing about the fan edition that surprises people most consistently. The fan is not moving the carbon or the water. It is moving the air through the carbon and the water, which means the fan's contribution to the system is entirely in the domain of airflow volume and has no effect on the material's intrinsic properties. The carbon surface area is unchanged. The latent heat of vaporization is unchanged. What the fan does is ensure that the air delivered to those properties is the fresh outdoor air entering the space rather than the already treated interior air recirculating through the tray, which would progressively reduce the concentration gradient driving both evaporation and adsorption toward zero. The cross breeze and the solar fan are both expressions of the same requirement. Air moving through the tray must be air entering the space from outside, carrying its full load of heat and airborne compounds, presenting itself to the carbon surface for the first time. Recirculated interior air has already been partially treated and carries a reduced load of the target molecules, making each pass through the tray less productive than the first. Intake placement ensures fresh air. Airflow, whether natural or fan-assisted, ensures adequate volume. Together, they produce a system that performs the dual function continuously and reliably through conditions ranging from the gentle breezes of an early summer morning to the still, punishing heat of an afternoon in late July. Before that afternoon arrives with its full weight, one condition of the system's use must be addressed completely and without any softening of its seriousness, because the same surface area that makes activated charcoal an exceptional air treatment medium creates a specific hazard in a specific type of enclosure that has nothing to do with the material's chemistry and everything to do with its interaction with the oxygen in sealed air. The hazard is real, documented in industrial safety literature, and entirely preventable by a single rule that takes less than one sentence to state, but deserves considerably more than one sentence of explanation. Elias states the rule first before the explanation, because he considers the order non-negotiable. The rule is this: activated charcoal in a tray must never be placed in a fully sealed, unventilated space where no air movement enters or exits the enclosure. Not a sealed room, not a closed cabinet, not an airtight container with the lid placed on top to concentrate the effect. The system works by treating moving air, and in the absence of moving air, it does something entirely different. Something that has sent workers to hospitals and, in documented industrial cases, has been fatal. The mechanism is not chemical toxicity. The activated charcoal is not releasing a poison into the sealed air. What it is doing is removing oxygen from that air by adsorbing it onto its pore surfaces, a process that industrial safety literature describes in confined space hazard documentation, and that occupational health agencies in both the United States and the United Kingdom have recorded in incident reports involving workers entering sealed vessels or storage containers holding freshly activated carbon. The same surface chemistry that captures ammonia and volatile organic compounds from incoming airstream also captures oxygen, and in an enclosed space where the total oxygen supply is fixed and finite, this adsorption can reduce the oxygen concentration to levels that impair consciousness before the occupant is aware that anything has changed. Oxygen deficiency is a particularly dangerous hazard because it does not announce itself through sensation the way carbon dioxide buildup does. Elevated carbon dioxide causes noticeable breathlessness and discomfort that prompts a person to seek fresh air before the situation becomes critical. Oxygen deficiency at mild to moderate levels causes euphoria, mild disorientation, and a reduction in the urgency response that would normally drive a person toward an exit. A person in a mildly oxygen-depleted environment may feel slightly lightheaded and pleasant rather than alarmed, which is exactly the perceptual state least likely to generate the behavioral response of leaving the space. The industrial incidents that establish this hazard as real rather than theoretical involve workers entering tanks, ship holds, and storage silos containing activated carbon, finding colleagues unconscious or deceased, and in some cases becoming incapacitated themselves before reaching the exit. The United Kingdom's Health and Safety Executive has published guidance on confined space hazards involving activated carbon specifically, noting that the oxygen-absorbing property of the material is most acute when the carbon is freshly activated or freshly regenerated and has not yet reached equilibrium with the surrounding atmosphere. A tray of carbon that has just been sun-regenerated, with its full surface area freshly cleared and available, presents the maximum oxygen absorption risk until it has been exposed to open air for a period sufficient to reach surface equilibrium. This does not mean that activated charcoal in a tray at an open window is dangerous. It means that the open window is not an optional feature of the system. The moving air that the system requires to function as a cooling and purification tool is simultaneously the safety mechanism that prevents oxygen adsorption from reducing the local concentration of breathable air to a hazardous level. When air is continuously moving through and past the tray, the oxygen removed by adsorption is continuously replaced by fresh outdoor air, and the net oxygen concentration in the room remains unchanged. The hazard exists only when that replacement stops, when the space is sealed and the air supply becomes finite. The practical implications of this rule are specific and easy to apply. A bedroom window with a tray on the sill must remain open while the tray is present, not merely cracked, but genuinely open to allow airflow. A co-op vent with a charcoal frame installed must remain unblocked and functional throughout the period the frame is in place. A sick room using the system must have at least one open window or vent, providing continuous air exchange. If conditions arise, a sudden rainstorm, a cold night, a need to seal the space for any reason, the tray should be removed from the room before the space is closed, not left inside a sealed enclosure on the assumption that the small carbon surface area in a domestic tray is insufficient to matter. Elias is characteristically direct about the scale of the domestic risk relative to the industrial incidents. A single tray containing 1 kilogram of activated carbon in a bedroom of standard size with a genuinely open window presents a hazard profile he considers negligible, because the ratio of carbon surface area to room air volume and fresh air supply is far removed from the confined space conditions that produced industrial fatalities. He does not minimize the industrial incidents. He cites them as the reason the rule exists, and the reason it is stated without exception, rather than with qualifications about how small the domestic risk is in practice. The rule without exceptions is more useful than the rule with a calibrated risk assessment attached to it, because a rule with exceptions invites people to evaluate whether their specific situation qualifies for the exception, which is precisely the cognitive process most likely to produce a dangerous outcome when the evaluation is made by someone unfamiliar with the relevant hazard. Stating the rule, absolutely, no sealed spaces, full stop, eliminates the evaluation step and produces consistent safe behavior across the full range of people who will encounter this system in the full range of conditions they will actually deploy it in. Beyond the oxygen question, no other safety concern attaches to correctly sourced activated charcoal in an open, ventilated application. The material is not flammable in the wet condition it operates in during normal use. It is not toxic by skin contact. It does not release compounds into the air it treats. It does not interact dangerously with the water used to wet it. The one rule, followed consistently, accounts for the one real hazard. And everything outside that single condition is a system that a child can build and a family can live with through an entire summer without incident. The safety cleared and the rules stated. What remains is the application where the system performs most dramatically and where the welfare stakes are highest. The co-op on a July afternoon, with a flock of birds that cannot leave, cannot sweat, and cannot tell anyone that the air they are breathing is already harming them. This is where $7.15 justify themselves most completely, and where the gap between knowing how to build this system and not knowing how has consequences measured in the health and survival of animals in a person's care. A chicken at 93 degrees Fahrenheit is an animal. In a physiological negotiation it did not choose and cannot exit. The bird stands with its wings held slightly away from its body, beak open, drawing air across the moist surfaces of its throat in the only heat dissipation behavior available to a creature without sweat glands. This panting is not distress signaling in the way that a dog's panting signals contentment after exercise. It is a compensatory respiratory effort that disrupts the bird's blood chemistry as carbon dioxide is expelled faster than the metabolic rate produces it, shifting blood pH in a direction that impairs calcium metabolism, reduces eggshell quality, and suppresses the immune response that stands between the flock and the pathogens present in every agricultural environment. The temperature threshold at which this physiological negotiation begins losing is not as high as most backyard flock keepers assume. Heat stress in chickens becomes clinically significant as temperatures climb into the low 30s Celsius, which translates to the high 80s and low 90s Fahrenheit, a range that any summer afternoon in the American mid-Atlantic, South or Midwest, can produce routinely and sustain for days during a genuine heat wave. The bird's core temperature begins rising above its normal range of approximately 41 degrees Celsius, and once it crosses 44 degrees Celsius, heat stroke becomes the likely outcome rather than the possible one. A co-op that retains daytime heat through its thermal mass can maintain interior temperature several degrees above the outdoor air temperature well into the evening, extending the period of heat stress beyond the hottest afternoon hours into the night when the birds are attempting to rest. Ammonia compounds this thermal stress in a way that the two problems together produce an outcome worse than either alone would suggest. At 25 parts per million, the concentration established by University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Research as the threshold for respiratory tract damage in poultry, ammonia begins eroding the mucosal lining of the bird's airways. This lining is the first barrier between the bird's immune system and the airborne pathogens circulating in the coop environment, and once it is compromised by ammonia exposure, the bird's susceptibility to respiratory infections including infectious bronchitis, Newcastle disease, and Mycoplasma gallisepticum increases substantially. A flock experiencing simultaneous heat stress and ammonia exposure above 25 parts per million is a flock with two of its primary defense systems simultaneously suppressed. The cruelty of this situation, if cruelty is the right word for a consequence no one intended, is that neither stressor is visible from outside the co-op on a casual inspection. A flock, panting in the heat, looks like a flock that is warm. A coop smelling of ammonia looks like a coop that needs cleaning. The behavioral and physiological consequences accumulating beneath these surface observations: reduced feed conversion, suppressed immune function, declining egg production, increasing vulnerability to secondary infection, develop slowly enough that no single afternoon appears catastrophic, and the cumulative damage is attributed to the season rather than to a specific, addressable air quality failure. By the time a keeper notices that the flock's production has dropped or that the birds are showing respiratory symptoms, the air quality problem has been running for weeks. Research on ammonia's effects on poultry immunology indicates that measurable immune suppression develops within days of sustained exposure above the threshold concentration, not over weeks or months, which means the damage accrues rapidly and quietly while the keeper is managing the dozen other tasks that a functioning farm or homestead generates every day. The ammonia smell that registers as unpleasant to a human visitor entering the coop has been registering as tissue damage to the birds for considerably longer than the human nose was present to notice it. Heat and ammonia together constitute the two-front air quality crisis that Elias's system addresses simultaneously, And the simultaneity is what makes the $7 solution worth understanding in terms that go beyond cost comparison. A keeper who addresses heat stress with a mechanical fan and addresses ammonia with increased cleaning frequency is managing two separate interventions with two separate labor requirements and two separate ongoing costs. The charcoal tray at the coop vent addresses both in the same action. At the intake, where every cubic foot of air entering the building passes through the treatment surface before reaching the birds. The fan moves hot, ammonia-laden air faster. The charcoal tray delivers cooler, cleaner air from the start. The welfare framing is not sentimental. It is the accurate description of what air quality means for an animal that cannot leave its environment, cannot communicate its distress in terms a human observer readily interprets, and cannot benefit from veterinary intervention after the fact as effectively as it benefits from prevention of the conditions that make intervention necessary. A flock that breathes air that has been cooled by several degrees and stripped of ammonia at the intake vent does not merely perform better on production metrics, though it does that too. It experiences a summer that is physiologically manageable rather than physiologically damaging, which is a distinction that matters on its own terms regardless of the economic calculation. Elias does not use the language of animal welfare in formal terms. He uses the language of good stockmanship, which in his tradition means understanding what an animal needs and providing it through the most effective and economical means available. Stockmanship that ignores air quality in a co-op during July is not good stockmanship by that standard, regardless of how attentive it is in other respects. The birds are in his care. The air inside the coop is his responsibility. The charcoal tray is one of the cheapest and most effective ways he has found to discharge that responsibility in the thermal conditions that southeastern Pennsylvania generates every summer without exception. The most extreme version of this welfare responsibility arrives during the genuine heat waves that climatological records for Lancaster County document, occurring in most summers. Periods of 3 to 7 consecutive days when afternoon temperatures exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit and nighttime temperatures remain above 75, denying the coop's thermal mass the overnight cooling that allows it to begin the next day at a manageable temperature. During these events, the cumulative thermal load inside a poorly ventilated coop can reach levels where mortality in the flock is not a possibility but a probability, and where the keeper's options narrow to emergency interventions that are labor-intensive, expensive, and often insufficient. The charcoal tray does not eliminate this risk entirely, and Elias does not claim that it does. What it provides is a continuous baseline improvement in both temperature and air quality that shifts the flock's starting physiological condition at the beginning of each hot day from stressed to tolerable, which moves the point at which emergency interventions become necessary several degrees further along the temperature scale. In practical terms, a flock that begins a heat wave day in cooler, cleaner air has more physiological reserve available to manage the afternoon peak than a flock that began the day already accumulating heat and ammonia exposure from the night before. The $7 buys margin, and in a heat wave, margin is what determines whether the flock comes through intact. The co-op version of the system is a step beyond the basic tray, and the step is worth taking for any installation that will be permanent or semi-permanent rather than experimental. A shallow tray sitting on a windowsill works adequately for a bedroom or a sick room where the tray can be moved and managed easily. But a coop vent presents conditions that the open tray does not handle well without modification. Birds investigate objects in their environment by pecking at them, and a shallow tray of moist black granules sitting within reach of a curious flock will be scattered, sampled, and redistributed across the coop floor within a morning. The solution is a frame that encloses the carbon on all sides, presents a wire mesh face to the airstream, and mounts across the vent opening in a fixed position that the birds cannot reach or disturb. The frame Elias builds is constructed from scrap lumber, specifically the dimensional scrap that accumulates in any working farm's woodpile from previous construction and repair projects. He uses pieces cut to form a shallow rectangular box, typically between 3 and 4 inches deep, sized to fit the specific vent opening it will occupy. The exact dimensions vary by installation, but the principle is consistent. 4 sides forming a rectangular perimeter, a solid back panel or open back depending on whether the frame will be mounted, flush against the vent opening or set slightly forward of it, and a front face made of wire mesh or hardware cloth with openings small enough to contain the carbon granules while permitting free airflow through the bed. Hardware cloth with a 1/4-inch mesh opening is the specification Elias uses for the front face, and the choice reflects two competing requirements. The mesh must be fine enough to retain the carbon granules, which in standard aquarium grade are typically between 1/16 and 1/4 of an inch in their largest dimension, so that granules do not fall through the face and onto the coop floor. It must also be coarse enough to present minimal resistance to the airflow that the ventilation system depends on, because a face material that restricts airflow defeats the purpose of placing the treatment surface at the intake. 1/4-inch hardware cloth satisfies both requirements for standard granular aquarium carbon and is available at any hardware or farm supply store for a few dollars per roll. The assembly uses staples or small screws to fix the hardware cloth across the front face of the wooden frame, pulled taut to prevent sagging under the weight of the carbon bed. Elias adds a small lip along the bottom interior edge of the frame, a strip of wood, perhaps 1/2 inch tall, to prevent granules from migrating toward the front face and potentially blocking the mesh over time as the carbon settles under the influence of gravity and daily re-wetting. The lip keeps the carbon bed positioned slightly back from the mesh face, maintaining the airflow gap between the bed surface and the mesh that ensures air passes through the full depth of the bed rather than compressing the carbon against the face and reducing its permeability. Mounting the frame to the vent opening uses whatever attachment method the vent structure supports. In a coop with a simple rectangular vent cut through the wall and covered with hardware cloth, the charcoal frame replaces the hardware cloth directly, attached with screws through the frame's perimeter into the surrounding wall framing. In a coop with adjustable louvered vents, the frame mounts on the exterior face of the vent housing, positioned so that air entering through the louvers passes through the carbon bed before entering the building interior. In either case, the goal is ensuring that the frame occupies the full cross-sectional area of the vent opening without gaps at the edges that would allow untreated air to bypass the carbon bed. Elias fits his frames with a simple gravity latch on one side that allows the frame to be swung open like a small door for daily re-wetting access without unmounting it from the vent. This detail took him 2 summers to arrive at, after spending the first 2 seasons removing and remounting the frame each morning for the wetting operation, which added 5 minutes to the maintenance routine and eventually loosened the mounting screws enough to require replacement. The swing-open latch reduces the daily maintenance operation to opening the frame, pouring water evenly across the carbon bed, allowing excess to drain through the mesh face and drip outside the coop below the vent opening, and latching the frame closed again. The total time from opening the latch to closing it is under 2 minutes. The drainage consideration is worth specific attention because it affects both the maintenance routine and the structural longevity of the installation. When the carbon bed is re-wetted, the excess water that drains off must go somewhere, and in a frame mounted flush to the exterior wall of a coop, that somewhere is down the face of the wall below the vent opening. Over a summer of daily re-wetting, this drainage creates a wet stripe on the exterior wall surface that can accelerate weathering of untreated wood. Elias addresses this by treating the wall section below his vent frames with a coat of exterior paint or linseed oil before installing the frames each season, which slows moisture absorption into the wood and extends the life of the wall surface without requiring any structural modification. The interior face of the frame, the back of the carbon bed as seen from inside the coop, is left open in Elias's standard design, meaning that the carbon bed itself is the boundary between the outdoor air and the coop interior. Air entering through the front mesh face passes through the full depth of the carbon bed and exits through the open back directly into the coop interior. This open back design maximizes airflow through the bed and eliminates the pressure drop that a second mesh face on the back of the frame would introduce, at the cost of allowing birds that can reach the back of the frame to peck at the carbon surface. Mounting the frame at a height above the reach of floor-level birds, or adding a simple horizontal deflector board below the frame interior, prevents contact without restricting airflow. The completed frame, mounted, filled, and wetted, is a permanent installation that requires daily re-wetting during hot weather and monthly removal for sun regeneration of the carbon bed, the latter being the maintenance step that extends the life of the material through multiple seasons, rather than requiring replacement after every few weeks of use. On the hottest afternoons of a Lancaster County summer, this frame, measuring perhaps 12 inches by 18 inches across a vent opening, moves enough treated air into a standard laying coop of 10 by 12 feet to produce a measurable temperature differential between the air at the vent and the air at the opposite wall, and to reduce the ammonia concentration in the interior air to a level below the threshold for respiratory damage in the birds. The frame is built from scrap. The carbon costs $7. The hardware cloth for the face costs $2 or $3 if it is not already present on the farm, and it usually is. The total investment for a permanent, functioning installation that addresses the two compounding summer stressors in a chicken coop is under $15 and a Saturday morning of construction time, which is a different order of magnitude from the cost of the mechanical alternatives. And it produces results that Elias can demonstrate by handing a visitor a thermometer and asking them to measure the air at the vent face and at the far wall of the coop on a 90-degree afternoon. The principle that works in the co-op vent does not belong exclusively to chickens, and Elias makes this point by walking a visitor through his property on a July afternoon and stopping at each structure in turn. The rabbit hutch sits against the south wall of the main barn, a wooden enclosure housing 6 does and a buck through the breeding season, and it presents the same air quality problem as the coop in a smaller volume. Rabbits are more sensitive to heat than chickens by a meaningful margin, showing signs of heat stress at temperatures above 84 degrees Fahrenheit, and they are equally incapable of sweating, relying on ear vasodilation and respiration to shed excess heat in conditions that a healthy adult human would find merely uncomfortable. The hutch version of the charcoal frame is smaller than the coop version, sized to the hutch's single ventilation panel on the shaded north face of the enclosure, and it uses the same construction method with one modification. Rabbits are considerably more destructive investigators of novel objects than chickens, capable of pulling mesh away from a frame with their teeth and strong enough to dislodge a poorly secured installation within a day of its introduction. Elias doubles the staple spacing on the hardware cloth attachment and adds a thin wooden batten over each edge of the mesh where it meets the frame, screwed through both the batten and the mesh into the frame perimeter, which converts the mesh attachment from a staple pull-out risk into a batten removal requirement that exceeds the motivation of even a determined rabbit. The kennel application addresses the same thermal and air quality problem in a domestic context that most urban and suburban households can relate to directly. A dog kennel or run enclosed on multiple sides with chain link or solid fencing traps heat on summer afternoons in the same way a coop does, and a dog's primary heat dissipation mechanism is panting, identical in principle to the bird's respiratory effort and subject to the same diminishing returns when the ambient air is already hot and still. A charcoal frame mounted in the shaded end of a kennel run, at the point where prevailing air movement enters the enclosure, reduces the thermal load and strips the volatile compounds that accumulate in any enclosed space where an animal lives and eliminates waste. The barn corner application is the least structured of the variations Elias demonstrates and the most adaptable to irregular spaces. Large barn interiors do not have defined intake vents the way a purpose-built coop does, instead relying on open doors, gaps in the siding, and ridge vents for ventilation, which makes identifying a single intake point for a charcoal frame less straightforward. Elias's approach in his main barn is to identify the corner or section where air movement is most consistently present during afternoon hours, determined by the same incense smoke observation he uses in the coop, and to place a large, open tray of wet activated charcoal on a shelf or sawhorse at that location. The tray does not intercept the full air change volume of the barn, the way a vent frame intercepts the full flow through a coop vent, but it treats the air in its immediate vicinity and reduces the ammonia and volatile compound concentration in the area where animals are most likely to rest during peak heat hours. The sick room is the human application that Elias considers most personally significant, and the reason is specific. During the winter of his youngest child's 3rd year, the child developed a chest illness that required 2 weeks of rest in a bedroom with the windows kept partially closed against the February cold. The air in that room, recycled by a sick child's respiration and warmed by the small wood stove kept running to maintain a comfortable temperature, became progressively more stale and oppressive over the first several days, in the way that any closed room with a sick occupant does, and the family had no mechanical air treatment to address it. Elias placed a tray of wet-activated charcoal on the windowsill of the child's room, with the window opened by 2 inches to admit the minimum airflow needed to move air through the carbon bed without chilling the room. The temperature reduction from the evaporative cooling was negligible in February conditions, and he was not expecting it. What he was expecting, based on his experience with the co-op application, was a reduction in the volatile compounds and staleness of the recycled indoor air, and this is what he observed within the first hour of the tray's placement. The room's air quality, assessed by the simple measure of how it felt to breathe, improved noticeably before the end of the first day. The child's recovery proceeded without complications, and Elias does not attribute that outcome to the charcoal tray alone, but he has placed one in every sick room in his household since that winter. You won't believe this, but the sick room application requires no modification to the basic tray design beyond sizing the tray to fit the available windowsill width and adjusting the window opening to the minimum that sustains airflow while managing the temperature of the room. A south-facing window in winter admits enough solar radiation to warm the room against the small heat loss from the 2-inch gap, making the opening practical even in cold conditions if the tray is positioned to block the direct wind that would otherwise make a 2-inch winter opening uncomfortable. The tray works in this configuration without the evaporative cooling function contributing meaningfully, relying entirely on the adsorption function to improve air quality, which means the system's value in a sick room is independent of the season and the outdoor temperature. Beyond the sick room, the same tray performs identically in a home office where a person spends 8 hours per day in a space that does not receive adequate fresh air exchange, in a basement apartment where the only ventilation is a small window at ground level, in a garage workshop where solvents and adhesives introduce volatile compounds into the working air, and in any vehicle parked in the sun where the interior air becomes a closed, hot, chemically loaded environment before the driver enters it. The physics do not change with the application. A surface area measured in hundreds of square meters per gram, wetted and placed in the path of moving air, performs the same 2 functions in every context. What changes between applications is the scale of the installation, the mounting method, and the frequency of re-wetting required by the specific conditions of heat and airflow present in each location. The principle is fixed. The implementation is flexible enough to be adapted by anyone with a shallow container, a bag of aquarium carbon, and access to water, which describes essentially every household and farm in the country, regardless of location, income, or access to specialized tools or suppliers. The flexibility of application is the reason Elias does not think of this as a chicken coop solution that happens to work in other places. He thinks of it as an air quality tool that happens to be demonstrable most dramatically in a chicken coop, where the stakes are visible, the improvement is measurable, and the cost comparison with alternatives is most stark. The coop is where the argument is easiest to make. The principle is where the argument actually lives, and the principle is as applicable to the bedroom window in a Philadelphia row house as it is to the barn vent on a Lancaster County farm. The most important sentence Elias says about the cooling function is the one that describes what it cannot do. And he says it before anyone asks because a person who builds this system expecting an outcome the physics cannot deliver will conclude that the principle is wrong when the principle is entirely correct and the expectation was the problem. The cooling effect is real. It is measurable with an ordinary thermometer. It is meaningful to a bird or a person in the treated airstream, and it varies by a factor of several depending on one atmospheric condition over which neither the builder nor the tray has any influence. That condition is humidity, and its effect on evaporative cooling is not subtle. The relationship between humidity and evaporative cooling performance is direct and inverse. As humidity rises, the rate of evaporation from the wet carbon surface falls, and as the evaporation rate falls, The quantity of heat extracted from the passing air falls with it. In air that is already heavily saturated with moisture, approaching 80 or 90% relative humidity, the evaporation from the tray surface slows to a rate that produces a temperature reduction measured in single degrees Fahrenheit rather than the 5 to 10 degrees available in dry conditions. The adsorption function is unaffected by humidity and continues operating at full capacity regardless of atmospheric moisture, but the cooling function shrinks toward its minimum in the same conditions that make a summer afternoon feel most oppressive to the people and animals enduring it. The meteorological tool for predicting this performance honestly is the wet bulb temperature, and understanding it takes one careful minute that pays dividends every time a heat forecast appears on the Weather Service. The wet bulb temperature is measured by wrapping a thermometer bulb in a wet cloth and exposing it to airflow, allowing evaporation from the cloth to cool the thermometer to the lowest temperature that evaporative cooling can theoretically achieve under the current atmospheric conditions. The gap between the actual air temperature, called the dry bulb temperature, and this wet bulb temperature is precisely the cooling budget that evaporation has available to spend. A large gap means substantial cooling is possible. A small gap means evaporative cooling has little room to work. On a dry afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where July relative humidity routinely falls below 20%, the gap between dry bulb and wet bulb temperature can exceed 25 degrees Fahrenheit. A charcoal tray in a vent opening on that afternoon has 25 degrees of thermal headroom to work within, and while it will not achieve the theoretical maximum, it will deliver a meaningful fraction of it as a real temperature reduction in the treated airstream. On a humid afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, where July relative humidity frequently exceeds 80%, the same gap may be only 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving the evaporative function with almost nothing to do thermally, while the adsorption function continues its work unimpeded. Elias's position in Lancaster County places him in the middle of this spectrum for most of the summer, with relative humidity values that oscillate between 40 and 75% depending on the day and the weather pattern, producing cooling effects that range from modest to meaningful across the course of a single week. He has measured the temperature of air at his coop vent face on both ends of this range, recording drops of 7 degrees Fahrenheit on the driest afternoons and drops of 2 degrees on the most humid, and he considers both measurements useful because they tell him what the system is delivering on a given day rather than what he wishes it were delivering. The honest statement for a viewer in a humid climate is this: the adsorption function will work fully in your location regardless of the humidity, and the cooling function will work partially, delivering a smaller temperature reduction than a viewer in a dry climate will experience, but not zero. 2 degrees of temperature reduction in the air entering a coop during a heat wave is not the same as 7 degrees, but it is not nothing either. And combined with the ammonia reduction that the adsorption function produces independently of humidity, the system improves the air quality of the space along 2 dimensions simultaneously even when the cooling contribution is at its minimum. The viewers most likely to be disappointed by the system are those in genuinely humid coastal climates: the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic seaboard south of Virginia, the Great Lakes shore during humid continental weather patterns, who encounter this information hoping for a solution to summer heat that matches what mechanical air conditioning delivers in those conditions. The honest answer for those viewers is that the cooling function of this system is not a replacement for mechanical air conditioning in high humidity climates. It is a supplement that improves air quality, provides modest cooling, and operates at no ongoing cost while delivering the full adsorption benefit regardless of outdoor conditions. Beyond that honest accounting, the system retains its full value in humid climates for the applications where air quality rather than temperature reduction is the primary concern. A co-op in coastal Georgia that gains 2 degrees of cooling from the tray also gains the full ammonia reduction benefit, which addresses the most dangerous component of the summer air quality problem in that coop, regardless of what the humidity does to the thermal performance. A sick room in a humid August in Savannah benefits from the adsorption function reducing volatile compound loading in the room air, even if the evaporative cooling produces only a degree of temperature change. The system delivers 2 jobs. Humidity affects one of them significantly, and the other not at all. The wet bulb temperature concept gives any viewer the tool to predict their own results without relying on anyone's testimony about what the system does in their specific location. The National Weather Service publishes wet bulb temperature alongside standard meteorological data in many of its forecasting products, and the calculation from relative humidity and dry bulb temperature is available through any standard psychrometric chart, which is available as a free download from multiple weather and engineering education sources. A viewer who checks their local wet bulb temperature on a representative summer afternoon and subtracts it from the dry bulb temperature knows, within a reasonable margin, the maximum cooling contribution the tray can make at their location on days with similar atmospheric conditions. That number, honestly obtained and accurately interpreted, is the beginning of a realistic conversation about what the system will and will not do in any specific climate, which is the kind of conversation that generates trust between a content creator and an audience, rather than the disappointment that follows oversold promises. Elias considers this the most important kind of honesty in practical instruction, telling people not just what something does, but how to measure what it will do for them specifically, so that the knowledge they leave with is applicable rather than merely impressive. The United States contains within its borders two essentially different summer climates for the purposes of evaporative cooling, and the line between them is not a political boundary or a geographic feature, but a humidity gradient that runs roughly north to south through the middle of the country, shifting east and west with the seasonal weather patterns that determine whether a given afternoon's air carries enough moisture to limit evaporation or enough dryness to permit it fully. Understanding which side of that gradient a viewer lives on is the single most useful piece of self-knowledge they can carry away from this section, because it determines the honest performance expectation for the cooling function of the tray before a dollar is spent. West of the 100th meridian, which runs approximately through the middle of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, before the landscape transitions toward the arid southwest, summer afternoons are frequently characterized by relative humidity values below 40% and often below 20% during the driest stretches. These are the conditions under which evaporative cooling performs most dramatically. A farmer in Billings, Montana, or a homesteader outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, or a backyard flock keeper in the Central Valley of California operates in summer air that presents the evaporative function with a large thermal budget to spend, and the tray delivers into that budget with consistent effect. Measured temperature drops in these dry western conditions, reported by people who have built the basic tray system and recorded before and after readings at the vent face, cluster in the range of 6 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit reduction in the temperature of the treated airstream on representative summer afternoons. Some measurements from particularly dry locations in the interior Southwest reach higher than this during the driest weeks before the summer monsoon pattern arrives in late July and shifts the regional humidity upward. These numbers reflect the cooling function operating near its practical maximum under real field conditions rather than controlled laboratory settings, which means they include the variability of imperfect construction, variable airflow rates, and the natural fluctuations of outdoor humidity through the course of a day. The humid South presents a genuinely different performance profile, and describing it honestly requires resisting the temptation to soften the numbers in the interest of maintaining enthusiasm. A poultry keeper in central Alabama, coastal Mississippi, or the Piedmont of Georgia operates in summer air where afternoon relative humidity values routinely exceed 70% and frequently approach 90% during the extended humid periods that characterize a Gulf-influenced summer climate. In these conditions, the wet bulb temperature sits close enough to the dry bulb temperature that the evaporative function's cooling budget is measured in 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 10 or 12. 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit is not a number that generates excitement in a product demonstration. It is, however, a number that matters to a chicken standing in a coop at 92 degrees on an August afternoon in Birmingham. The difference between 92 degrees and 89 degrees is the difference between a bird at the upper edge of manageable heat stress and a bird that has crossed into the range where physiological compensation is failing. 3 degrees bought by a tray of charcoal costing $7 represents, in the context of a heat wave that is going to last a week, a meaningful contribution to the flock's ability to come through that week without losses, even when it does not represent the dramatic cooling that a viewer in Arizona might experience from the same installation. The adsorption function in the humid south operates identically to its operation in the arid west, which is the part of the performance picture that justifies the system equally across both climate regions regardless of the humidity differential. Ammonia does not care about outdoor humidity. Volatile organic compounds do not adsorb less readily onto activated charcoal surfaces, because the air carrying them is also carrying more moisture. The carbon's pore surfaces capture these molecules through the same surface forces in humid Charleston air as in dry Denver air, and the air quality improvement from the adsorption function is therefore available in full to every climate in the country, delivering the welfare benefit to the flock and the comfort benefit to the room, regardless of what the thermometer and the hygrometer say about the afternoon's cooling budget. The regional honest expectation, stated plainly for both major climate zones, is this: in the dry west, build the system and expect meaningful cooling alongside full air cleaning, and plan to be genuinely impressed by the thermal performance on the driest afternoons. In the humid south and the Atlantic seaboard, build the system and expect modest cooling alongside full air cleaning, plan to measure the temperature drop honestly, rather than hoping for western numbers in a southern climate, and recognize that the air quality improvement alone justifies the $7 and the 15 minutes in a co-op, where the birds are already above the ammonia threshold. The Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic region, including the Mid-Atlantic states where Lancaster County sits, experience a seasonal transition that puts them on both sides of this performance divide at different points in the summer. June and early July in Pennsylvania often bring humidity values low enough to produce Western-style cooling performance, while late July and August, when the Bermuda high-pressure system pushes warm, moist Gulf air northward along the eastern seaboard, shift the humidity toward values that compress the cooling budget toward the southern end of the range. A keeper in this middle band experiences the full range of the system's thermal performance within a single summer, which is actually a useful condition for developing an accurate intuitive sense of how humidity affects the result. Elias tracks this seasonal variation not with meteorological instruments, but with the simple observation of how long the wetted carbon takes to dry out between morning re-wettings. On dry days, the carbon surface dries more quickly because evaporation is rapid, and the cooling function is working hard, consuming the stored water faster. On humid days, the carbon remains moist longer because evaporation is slow, and the cooling function is working within a narrow budget, consuming stored water at a reduced rate. The drying rate of the carbon is therefore a direct field indicator of the day's evaporative cooling performance, available to any keeper who simply notices how the tray feels at the end of the afternoon compared to how it felt at the end of the previous afternoon. This observational approach to performance monitoring, using the material's own behavior as the instrument rather than a separate measuring device, is characteristic of the practical tradition Elias comes from, and is one of the features of the system that makes it genuinely self-contained. The tray tells you how hard it is working by how fast it dries. The birds tell you whether the air quality is adequate by whether they are panting. The morning re-wetting tells you whether the previous day's treatment was sufficient by whether the granules are fully dry or retain some moisture from the day before. The feedback loop is built into the system without any additional instrumentation, and reading it correctly becomes second nature within the first week of operation. The maintenance schedule for this system is the part that most people, conditioned by years of products that require nothing until they catastrophically require replacement, find surprisingly simple to the point of suspicion. There is no filter cartridge with a replacement indicator light. There is no proprietary cleaning solution available exclusively from the manufacturer. There is no annual service visit, no warranty registration, no subscription to a replacement program that arrives quarterly, whether the material needs replacing or not. The maintenance has two components, one daily and one monthly, and both are performed with materials present on every farm and in every household in the country. The daily component is re-wetting, and the full operation takes between 90 seconds and 2 minutes from the moment of approach to the moment of walking away. Open the frame latch or lift the tray from the windowsill. Pour clean water evenly across the carbon surface, distributing it over the full bed area rather than concentrating it in one location. Wait approximately 60 seconds for the water to distribute through the pore network by capillary action. Tilt the tray or allow free water to drain through the mesh face before relatching the frame. The carbon should feel thoroughly damp under light finger pressure, releasing no free liquid but leaving the fingertip visibly wet. That is the complete daily maintenance operation, performed every morning during the period of active use. The timing of the daily re-wetting matters more than most builders initially appreciate. Morning is the correct time, not afternoon, and the reason connects directly to the evaporative function's performance through the day. A tray wetted in the morning begins the day fully charged with stored water, distributed evenly through the pore network of every granule, and this charge is the thermal reservoir that the evaporative function draws on through the hottest afternoon hours. A tray wetted in the afternoon, when the evaporation rate is already at its daily maximum due to peak temperature and minimum relative humidity, loses a disproportionate fraction of its water charge in the first hour after wetting, before the deep pore network has had time to absorb and redistribute the added water, resulting in a tray that performs poorly through the evening and night. Water quality for the re-wetting is a practical consideration that deserves one specific note. Hard water, containing high concentrations of dissolved calcium and magnesium minerals, deposits these minerals on the carbon surfaces as the water evaporates, progressively coating the pore openings with a thin mineral film that reduces both the adsorptive capacity and the water retention of the material over multiple weeks of use. In areas with notably hard water, Elias recommends rinsing the carbon bed with collected rainwater or distilled water once per week during the regular re-wetting operation, which dissolves and flushes the mineral deposits before they accumulate to a level that meaningfully degrades performance. In areas with soft or moderately hard water, plain tap water for daily re-wetting produces no noticeable performance degradation over a full season of use. The monthly component is sun regeneration, and it is the step that transforms the material from a consumable into a durable, reusable tool. After 3 to 4 weeks of continuous daily use, the adsorptive capacity of the carbon bed begins to decline as the pore surfaces approach saturation with captured molecules. This saturation is gradual rather than sudden, producing a progressive reduction in adsorption performance rather than an abrupt failure, and the first indication of approaching saturation is typically a subtle return of the odors that the fresh carbon was suppressing, noticed most clearly in the first hour after the morning re-wetting, when adsorption performance is highest, and the contrast with a saturated bed is most apparent. The regeneration process exploits the same physical reversibility of adsorption that makes the material scientifically interesting. Remove the carbon from the frame or tray and spread it in a single layer on a dark tray or sheet of metal placed in direct sunlight on a clear summer day. The solar heating raises the temperature of the carbon surface above the threshold needed to break the surface attraction, holding the captured molecules to the pore walls, driving those molecules off the carbon and into the open air where they disperse harmlessly in the outdoor environment. A full day of direct summer sunlight with the carbon spread no more than half an inch deep to ensure that solar heating reaches the full bed depth rather than just the surface layer is sufficient to restore the adsorptive capacity of the material to a level close to its original performance. Elias performs this regeneration on a clear day, when the forecast shows no rain for at least 12 hours following the spread, because rain on a partially regenerated bed re-wets the carbon before the process is complete and drives the released molecules back into surface contact rather than dispersing them. He uses a sheet of corrugated roofing metal painted black, which absorbs solar radiation efficiently and conducts heat into the carbon layer from below as well as receiving it from above, reducing the time required for full regeneration from a full day to approximately 6 hours of direct summer sunlight. The black metal sheet is a refinement rather than a requirement, and a plain aluminum baking sheet or a dark plastic tray produces adequate regeneration in a full day, even if the heating is less efficient. The replacement filter industry has structured its products around a cost model where the ongoing consumable expense exceeds the original purchase price within the first year of ownership. $7 per year for a material that can be regenerated and reused falls outside that model entirely, which is precisely why the model has no mechanism for accommodating it and no incentive to acknowledge it. The replacement filter business model is not a secret. It is discussed openly in business journalism, analyzed in investor presentations, and described in the annual reports of appliance manufacturers as a strategic asset rather than an incidental revenue stream. The technical term for it is the razor and blade model, named for the practice of selling a razor handle at a low margin or a loss and recovering the investment through the ongoing sale of replacement blades that fit only that handle and cannot be substituted. Applied to air purifiers, the handle is the branded housing with its proprietary filter slot, and the blade is the replacement cartridge available exclusively in the brand's own product line at the brand's own price point. The model works because it converts a one-time purchase decision into a recurring purchasing relationship that the customer enters without fully understanding its terms at the moment of the initial purchase. A person standing in a retailer's aisle comparing two purifiers at $150 and $200 is making a choice based on the purchase price, the filter rating, the airflow specification, and the physical dimensions of the unit. They are rarely comparing the 3-year total cost of ownership, including replacement cartridges, because that number is not displayed on the packaging and requires arithmetic that most people do not perform in a retail environment. The business model profits from that arithmetic not being done. 3 years of ownership of a mid-range activated carbon air purifier, including the initial purchase at $175 and replacement cartridges at $45 every 4 months, produces a total expenditure of approximately $575. The carbon inside those 9 replacement cartridges, stripped of its plastic housing and the brand's replacement schedule recommendation, represents perhaps $60 to $90 of raw material at commodity aquarium carbon pricing, depending on the gram weight per cartridge. The remaining $485 funds the housing, the fan motor, the marketing, the retail margin, and the recurring revenue structure that the business depends on for its profitability projections. This arithmetic is not a conspiracy. It is a business model, operating transparently within the normal structure of consumer goods markets, and it generates the investment that funds product development, quality control, and the retail distribution infrastructure that puts the product within reach of any consumer in the country. Elias does not argue that the industry is dishonest. He argues that the industry's incentive structure has no mechanism for informing a customer that the core functional material in its most important product is available at a fraction of the cost in the pet aisle, because informing customers of this fact would undermine the recurring revenue model that makes the business viable. The suppression of this information is therefore not active concealment, but structural invisibility. The industry does not publish warnings against using aquarium carbon in homemade tray installations. It simply does not discuss the topic, because discussing it would require acknowledging the material identity between the product's active ingredient and the commodity available at $7 a bag, which is a comparison that does not serve the marketing objective of maintaining the perception that the branded product's performance is inseparable from its proprietary packaging. Quiet is not the same as dishonesty, but quiet, when it operates consistently in a direction that benefits the party maintaining the quiet, functions similarly to suppression in its practical effect on consumer knowledge. The recurring bill is the chain, and Elias uses that word without apology. A household running 2 air purifiers through a summer replacing cartridges on schedule, spending on a swamp cooler for the rooms the purifiers do not cool, and paying the electricity cost of running all 3 machines through July and August, is spending several $100s per season on air quality that a handful of charcoal trays at the intake windows would provide at a material cost of under $30 for the season. The electricity cost alone for running 2 mid-range purifiers and a swamp cooler through a 90-day summer season, at average American residential electricity rates, approaches $80 to $100. Money that goes to a utility company for the privilege of running machinery that performs functions a passive system would handle without consuming power. Consider what the passive system costs over 10 years. A tray at each of 3 window intakes, regenerated monthly through each summer season, using 1 bag of carbon per tray per season at $7 per bag, cost $210 in materials over a decade. The equivalent mechanical system, 2 purifiers and a swamp cooler with replacement consumables and electricity, costs several $1,000s over the same period, a multiplier of 10 or more depending on equipment choices and local electricity rates. The performance difference between the two systems in a dry climate is modest. The cost difference is not. Beyond the direct financial comparison, the passive system carries a characteristic that the mechanical system cannot offer regardless of price: complete independence from supply chains, manufacturers, and utility providers. A replacement filter cartridge that is discontinued, back-ordered, or repriced upward by its manufacturer creates a crisis for the household that has built its air quality management around a specific proprietary product. A bag of activated charcoal, sold by dozens of manufacturers through hundreds of retail and online channels, priced as a commodity rather than a proprietary consumable, has no single point of supply failure, and no brand that can raise the price without losing the customer to a competitor selling chemically identical material at a lower price. The commodity nature of the material, which seems like a limitation from a branding perspective, is the feature that makes it genuinely reliable as the foundation of a long-term air quality strategy. The self-sufficiency this enables is not merely economic. It is the freedom from a recurring obligation that extends indefinitely into the future. The freedom from the quarterly calendar reminder to order replacement cartridges, from the monthly electricity charge for machines running continuously, from the dependence on a manufacturer's decision to continue supporting the product version you have built your system around. Elias does not frame this in ideological terms, though the Amish tradition he comes from has thought carefully about exactly this kind of dependence for several centuries. He frames it in practical terms. A system that asks nothing of you beyond water and sunlight in exchange for air that is cooler and cleaner than what you would otherwise breathe is a system worth understanding on its own merits regardless of what it says about the industry that sells the alternative. The knowledge required to build and maintain this system is not proprietary. It is not patented. It is not available exclusively from a licensed provider. It lives in the physical properties of a material available at commodity pricing, in the thermodynamic principles that govern evaporation, and in the surface chemistry of activated carbon that has been understood and documented in public scientific literature for more than a century. What has been missing is not the knowledge itself, but the organized, accessible presentation of that knowledge in a form that a person standing in a pet supply store aisle can translate directly into a decision and an action. The absence of this information from mainstream consumer channels is not mysterious when examined through the lens of how information about products and solutions reaches consumers in a market economy. Information travels through channels, and channels are funded by the entities that benefit from the information moving through them. Advertising funds media. Media publishes content that serves the audience that advertising is trying to reach. The audience that advertising is trying to reach is a purchasing audience, and a purchasing audience is most valuable to an advertiser when it is in the process of forming a purchase intention rather than in the process of discovering that a $7 material from the pet aisle renders the purchase unnecessary. No advertising budget exists for activated charcoal in a tray. The aquarium supply companies that sell the material earn their margin on a $7 bag once per season per customer, a revenue profile that does not support the marketing expenditure required to place this information in front of the consumers who would benefit from it. The air purifier brands that sell the expensive version of the same material have every structural reason to ensure that the comparison between their product and the commodity alternative is never made explicit in a consumer-facing context. The result is not a coordinated suppression, but a market-shaped silence, the kind that produces the same practical outcome as intentional concealment without requiring anyone to make a deliberate decision to hide anything. This distinction matters for credibility. Claiming that the air conditioning and air purification industries have actively suppressed knowledge of the charcoal tray system would require evidence of deliberate action, a meeting, a policy, a documented decision to withhold information, and that evidence does not exist because the suppression does not operate through deliberate action. It operates through incentive alignment. Every participant in the information ecosystem surrounding air quality products, the manufacturers, the retailers, the advertising-funded media, the influencer relationships funded by brand sponsorships, has financial incentives that align with promoting branded solutions, and no financial incentive that aligns with promoting the unbranded commodity alternative. The silence is the natural output of that incentive alignment, not a conspiracy, but a consequence. James Burt Garner's activated charcoal gas mask filter, developed in 1915 for soldiers in the trenches of northern France, saved lives precisely because the context of its development was military necessity rather than commercial incentive. There was no profit model to protect, no replacement cartridge revenue to optimize, no marketing budget to allocate. There was a gas attack and a need for a filter that worked, and the chemistry of activated carbon was applied to that need without any consideration of how the application would affect downstream revenue streams. The technology that resulted was then transferred, over the subsequent century, into commercial product lines that wrapped it in proprietary housings and recurring cost structures, a transfer that made the technology more accessible to consumers while simultaneously obscuring the simplicity and low cost of the underlying material. Here's the thing about information that no one profits from distributing. It tends to travel slowly and through informal channels rather than quickly through institutional ones. The person who knows about the charcoal tray learned it from a neighbor, a farming publication, a homesteading forum, or an agricultural extension document rather than from an advertisement or a product review in a consumer magazine. The information has not been absent from human knowledge. It has been present in exactly the communities that have structural reasons to care about cost-effective solutions: farming communities, self-sufficiency communities, and the aquarium hobby, while being absent from the consumer media channels that reach the much larger population of households that have no particular reason to seek out informal knowledge networks. The homesteading and small farm community has preserved a disproportionate fraction of the practical knowledge that market incentives have filtered out of mainstream consumer information. This is not because homesteaders are more intelligent than other consumers, but because they operate under an economic constraint that makes cost-effectiveness a primary evaluation criterion rather than a secondary one. A small farm with 30 laying hens and a seasonal income that depends partly on those birds cannot absorb a $300 purifier plus replacement cartridges as a routine operating expense. The search for a functional alternative at a lower cost is therefore a genuine economic necessity rather than a preference. And necessity generates the research effort that identifies the commodity solution hiding in the pet aisle. The Internet has accelerated the distribution of this category of information in ways that the market structure cannot fully compensate for, because the cost of distributing information online has fallen close enough to zero that the financial incentive to suppress distribution is no longer sufficient to prevent it. A video demonstrating a $7 air treatment system can reach the same audience as a television advertisement for a $300 purifier without requiring the advertising budget that the television format demands. This is the mechanism by which practical knowledge that market incentives filtered out of institutional channels for decades is now re-entering the information ecosystem through independent content creators, homesteading communities, and agricultural extension networks distributing their resources through digital channels. What's more, the credibility of this information does not depend on the channel through which it arrives. The chemistry of activated carbon is documented in public scientific literature available to any reader. The thermodynamics of evaporative cooling are taught in introductory physics courses. The welfare thresholds for poultry ammonia exposure are published by University Extension Services. The wet bulb temperature concept is standard meteorological education. None of the knowledge required to understand, build, and maintain this system is proprietary or inaccessible. What has been missing is not the knowledge itself, but the synthesis of it into a form that a person with a practical problem can translate into a practical action on a Saturday morning. The synthesis is the service this video is providing, and Elias is the person providing it, not because he has access to information that others lack, but because he has been applying this information in practice for more than 2 decades in a context where its performance could be evaluated honestly against the real conditions of a working farm. His authority is not credential-based. It is result-based, grounded in 30 summers of measuring whether the birds are panting, whether the ammonia is present, whether the air coming through the vent is cooler than the air outside, and whether the $7 spent at the beginning of the season has done what the physics said it would do. The reason you have not heard this before is not that it failed a test. It is that the test was never conducted in a context where the result could generate a financial return for the person reporting it, which meant the reporting did not happen through the channels where you would have encountered it. That condition has now changed because the cost of reporting has fallen and the audience for practical, honest, cost-effective knowledge has found the channels where that knowledge is being shared. You are in one of those channels now, and what comes next is the part where the knowledge becomes a set of actions simple enough to complete before lunch on any day this week. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives not with a dramatic event, but with the quiet realization that a problem you had been paying someone else to solve can be solved by your own hands with materials you can carry in a paper bag. It does not announce itself. It arrives when you place a tray at a window, pour water over black granules, and feel the air coming through the opening shift in quality and temperature within the first hour, without having called a technician, without having entered a credit card number, without having agreed to a terms of service document that obligates you to purchase replacement components from a single supplier at a price they set unilaterally. Elias Yoder does not use the language of self-sufficiency as a political statement. He uses it as a description of a practical condition he has maintained for 30 years on a farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And the condition is simply this: the essential functions of his household and his operation do not depend on ongoing commercial relationships that he did not choose and cannot exit. Heating, cooling, food production, water, and the air quality of his animals' living spaces are all managed through methods that require materials rather than services, inputs that he purchases once and uses many times rather than subscribing to in perpetuity. This is not ideology, it is arithmetic applied to a long enough time horizon. The arithmetic of dependency is rarely presented to consumers at the moment of purchase. A household that installs a central air conditioning system in 1995 is making a decision that will generate electricity bills, refrigerant service appointments, filter replacements, capacitor failures, compressor replacements, and eventual full system replacements across the following 30 years, none of which are itemized in the purchase price of the original installation. The total cost of that dependency, calculated honestly across its full duration, is a number that would alter many purchasing decisions if it were presented clearly at the moment of commitment, which is precisely why it is not presented clearly at that moment. The charcoal tray asks nothing of you in perpetuity. It asks for $7 once per season and 2 minutes each morning during the months of active use. Beyond that, it asks for a clear day once per month to spread the carbon in the sun. These are the complete terms of the relationship, stated fully and without hidden clauses, and they do not change at the discretion of a manufacturer, a utility provider, or a service company. The material does not require software updates. It does not become incompatible with future versions of itself. It does not require a proprietary re-wetting solution available only from a licensed distributor. It requires water, which falls from the sky, and sunlight, which costs nothing regardless of what the utility company charges for its electrical approximation. The deeper implication of this self-sufficiency is not primarily financial, though the financial implication is real and significant over any time horizon longer than a single season. The deeper implication is cognitive. A person who understands how a tool works is in a fundamentally different relationship with that tool than a person who merely operates it. The household that understands evaporative cooling and activated carbon adsorption can adapt the system to a new application, troubleshoot a performance decline, explain the principle to a neighbor, and teach it to a child, because the knowledge underlying the tool is transferable in a way that the operation of a branded appliance is not. Operating a branded air purifier requires knowing which button to press and when to order replacement cartridges. Understanding activated carbon adsorption requires knowing why the material works, which means knowing enough to apply it in contexts the original manufacturer never intended and never marketed. A person who understands why the charcoal tray works can build a version for a rabbit hutch, a version for a vehicle interior, a version for a greenhouse, a version for a basement workshop, a version for a sick room in winter, all from the same knowledge base, at the same material cost, without consulting a product manual or a service representative. This transferability of knowledge is what the self-sufficiency tradition that Elias represents has always understood as the genuine asset, more valuable than any specific tool or technique because it generates new tools and techniques in response to new problems. The Amish community's deliberate evaluation of which technologies to adopt is not, as it is sometimes characterized from outside, a rejection of progress. It is a consistent preference for knowledge that stays with the person over knowledge that stays with the product, for tools that the user understands over tools that the user merely operates, for solutions that generate independence over solutions that generate dependence. A person leaving this video with an accurate understanding of why wet activated charcoal at an intake vent cools and cleans incoming air has acquired something that no recall notice, discontinued product line, supply chain disruption, or price increase can take away. The chemistry of activated carbon will not change. The thermodynamics of evaporative cooling will not change. The aquarium hobby will continue to generate a commodity supply of the material at stable pricing because its own needs are independent of the air quality market. The knowledge is durable in a way that the appliance it replaces is not, and the durability of knowledge is the form of self-sufficiency that compounds most reliably across time. However, durable knowledge requires accurate knowledge, and accurate knowledge about this system includes its limits as clearly as its capabilities. A person who builds this tray, believing it will replace mechanical air conditioning in a humid climate, will be disappointed. A person who builds it, understanding that it delivers full adsorption performance in any climate and meaningful to modest evaporative cooling, depending on local humidity, will be satisfied and will be positioned to make informed decisions about where and when to supplement it with mechanical assistance. The honest limit is as much a part of the knowledge as the demonstrated capability, and carrying both is what makes the knowledge genuinely useful rather than merely impressive to repeat. The permission that is not required to build this system extends beyond the absence of a purchase obligation. No building permit is required to place a tray at a window. No licensed technician is required to install it. No homeowner association approval is required for an intervention that leaves no permanent mark on the structure and can be removed in 30 seconds. The only authority whose permission is relevant is the physics, and the physics granted permission for this application several 100 million years ago when the properties of carbon were established by the processes that form the planet. Everything since then has been a matter of whether the people who needed those properties knew they were available. Everything covered in this video reduces to 4 actions and 1 absolute rule, and Elias states them in the order of their importance rather than the order of their convenience, because a person who remembers the rule before the actions is a safer person than one who remembers only the actions. The rule first: never place this system in a fully sealed, unventilated space where no air movement enters or exits. Not in a closed room with the windows shut. Not in an airtight cabinet. Not in any enclosure where the air supply is finite and stationary. The window or vent must be open and functional while the tray is present. This is the complete safety requirement, stated once more in full because it deserves repetition and because the one person who needed to hear it twice is worth the 30 seconds of everyone else's time. The 4 actions begin with the purchase. Walk into any pet supply store, farm supply store, or garden center and locate either the aquarium filtration aisle or the horticultural section. Pick up a bag labeled activated carbon or activated charcoal. Verify that the ingredient list contains no binders, oxidizers, accelerants, or fuel use instructions, and confirm the price falls between $5 and $8 for a quantity of 100 grams or more. That bag is the complete material requirement for the first installation. Everything else needed for the basic version, a shallow container and access to water, is already present in any household or farm without additional purchase. The second action is the build. Choose the shallowest container available that holds material without leaking. Spread the activated charcoal to a depth of between 1 and 2 inches across the full container surface, and level the bed evenly by hand. Pour clean water slowly and evenly across the full bed surface until the carbon is thoroughly wet, and a small amount of water appears at the container bottom. Wait 2 minutes. Tilt the container and pour off the freestanding water until the bed feels damp under finger pressure, but releases no free liquid when lightly pressed. The tray is built and ready for placement from this moment forward. The third action is placement, and it is the decision that determines whether the system performs at its full capability or at a fraction of it. Place the tray at the window or vent opening where outdoor air enters the space, not in the center of the room, not against an interior wall, not in a location chosen for visibility or convenience, rather than for position in the airflow path. The tray belongs at the intake, where every unit of incoming air must pass through the carbon bed before entering the space. If natural airflow through the opening is uncertain or intermittent, a small fan positioned to draw air through the bed converts a weather-dependent system into a reliable one. The solar-powered fan is the preferred addition for anyone building a permanent installation in a co-op or outbuilding. The fourth action is maintenance, and it consists of 2 operations on 2 different schedules. Every morning during active use, re-wet the carbon bed using the same pour and drain procedure used during the initial build, ensuring that the bed is damp throughout but not waterlogged. Once per month, remove the carbon from the frame or tray and spread it in a thin layer on a dark surface in direct sunlight for a full day, allowing solar heat to drive the captured molecules off the pore surfaces and restore the adsorptive capacity of the material. Allow the carbon to cool completely before returning it to the frame, re-wetting it, and returning it to service. These 2 operations, totaling perhaps 20 minutes per month, including the daily re-wettings, are the complete maintenance burden of the system for the duration of its active use. The recap of what this system does, stated in the plainest possible language. Wet, activated charcoal at an air intake cools incoming air by evaporating water into it, extracting heat through the latent heat of vaporization, and simultaneously captures ammonia, volatile organic compounds, and odor-causing molecules from the airstream by adsorption onto the carbon's vast internal surface area. The cooling effect ranges from several degrees Fahrenheit in dry climates to a couple of degrees in humid ones. The adsorption effect operates at full capacity in all climates, regardless of humidity. The combined result is incoming air that is cooler and cleaner than the outdoor air from which it came, delivered continuously and passively for as long as the carbon remains wet and the air moves through it. The total cost of this result is $7 in materials, plus 2 minutes per day and 1 afternoon per month in maintenance time, plus the cost of the water used for re-wetting, which is negligible by any reasonable accounting. The system has no motor to burn out, no filter to dispose of, no electricity bill to generate, no proprietary replacement component to purchase, and no service relationship to maintain. It asks for water and sunlight and returns cooler, cleaner air, which is a transaction so favorable that the only reasonable question is why it took this long to find out about it. At the same time, carry the honest limits alongside the capabilities. The system is not a substitute for mechanical air conditioning in high humidity climates where the evaporative budget is narrow. It is not clinical-grade filtration for medical applications requiring controlled air quality standards. It is a passive, low-cost, continuously operating air treatment tool that addresses 2 compounding summer stressors simultaneously, heat and air quality, at a cost that makes it accessible to every household and farm in the country, regardless of income, regardless of access to skilled labor, and regardless of whether the building owner grants permission for a more permanent installation. Build this for the co-op first if you keep chickens, because that is where the welfare stakes are highest, and where the performance difference between treated and untreated air is most legible in the behavior of the birds on a hot afternoon. Build it for the bedroom window next, because sleeping in air that has been cooled and cleaned at the intake is a different experience from sleeping in air that entered the room untreated and was partially processed by a machine in the corner. Build it for every intake in every space where living things breathe air that could be better than what arrives without treatment. Which is to say, build it wherever it is needed, which on a July afternoon in most of the country is nearly everywhere. The one rule, stated once more at the close, because it is the rule. Open ventilation, always without exception, while the tray is present in any space. Everything else is detail and adjustment and application. The rule is not detail. It is the condition under which everything else works safely, and it is non-negotiable in every installation, regardless of scale, climate, species, or circumstance. The comment section of this video is about to become something more useful than a collection of reactions, and the reason is specific. Every viewer who builds this system and records an honest before and after temperature measurement contributes a data point that every subsequent viewer can use to calibrate their own expectations before spending $1 or investing 15 minutes. A single video can describe the wet bulb temperature principle and explain why humid climates produce smaller cooling effects than dry ones. But a comment section containing 50 measurements from 50 different locations across the country demonstrates that principle in a form that no explanation can match, because the measurements are real, they are geographically distributed, and they are produced by people with no financial stake in the outcome. So here is the specific question, and it is designed to generate the most useful possible response from every type of viewer, regardless of their climate, their situation, or whether they have already built the system or are still deciding. What space are you setting yours up in, and if you have already built it and measured the temperature drop, what number did you record, and where do you live? 2 sentences is enough. The space, the location, and the number if you have it. A viewer in Phoenix, Arizona, reporting a 9-degree drop in a coop vent on a July afternoon, and a viewer in coastal Georgia reporting a 2-degree drop in a bedroom window on an August evening are both contributing something that the next person in a similar climate needs before they can form an accurate expectation. The geographic distribution of these measurements is the living data set that this community can build together, and it has a practical value that exceeds what any single video can provide. Viewers in humid climates who are uncertain whether the modest cooling effect justifies the $7 investment can scroll through comments from other humid climate viewers and find honest accounts of what the system delivered in conditions similar to their own. Viewers in dry climates who want to know whether the performance in the high desert differs from the performance in the Central Valley can find both represented in the comment record. The comment section, seeded with specific, honest, geographically identified measurements, becomes a resource that improves with every contribution and remains useful to every viewer who discovers this video 6 months or 2 years from now. Beyond the temperature measurements, the community of people building this system generates something else that has value beyond the individual installation. Collective problem solving for the variations and refinements that a single demonstration cannot cover. A viewer who has modified the basic tray design to work in a round vent opening has solved a problem that the next person with a round vent will face, and a comment describing that modification costs the commenter 30 seconds and saves the reader an afternoon of figuring it out independently. A viewer who has discovered a particular brand of aquarium carbon that performs consistently across multiple seasons and regeneration cycles has information that every subsequent builder benefits from having before they make their first purchase. The homesteading and small farm community that will build the majority of co-op installations has a long tradition of this kind of collective, practical knowledge sharing, operating through agricultural extension networks, farming publications, and increasingly through the digital channels where practical demonstration content reaches the communities that need it. What this comment section can add to that tradition is the geographic specificity and the honest performance reporting that make the collective knowledge not just interesting, but actionable. Because a viewer who can find 5 comments from people in their own climate region reporting consistent results has more reliable information for their own decision than a viewer who has only the video's general guidance to work from. The question of what you will set yours up in is also an invitation to think beyond the applications covered in this video, because the principle is more broadly applicable than any single demonstration can cover fully. A viewer working in a small pottery studio where clay dust and kiln-off gassing create air quality challenges has a problem that the charcoal tray addresses through the adsorption function. A viewer with a basement workshop where adhesives and finishes introduce volatile compounds into the working air has a problem the system addresses from the same intake placement principle. A viewer caring for an elderly relative in a closed room through a summer illness has a sick room application that differs from the bedroom window case only in the scale of the re-wetting interval and the management of the minimal window opening. The comment that says, "I set mine up in a pottery studio window in Manchester, Vermont," and the smell of kiln-off gassing dropped noticeably within the first hour, is a comment that reaches the next person with a pottery studio who would never have thought to watch a video about chicken coops and air quality but finds it through a search for studio ventilation solutions. The specificity of application in comments is what makes the video's reach extend beyond the audience who came looking for exactly this topic, into the adjacent communities who share the underlying air quality problem without having encountered the solution. As a result, the comment section functions most effectively when it contains not just performance measurements but application descriptions, the specific spaces, the specific problems, and the specific results, because this combination is what search algorithms surface to people who are searching for solutions to those specific problems rather than for this specific video. A comment reading, "Set mine up in a dog kennel run in humid Central Florida. Got about 2 degrees of cooling, but the kennel smell was dramatically reduced within a day," is doing 3 things simultaneously: reporting an honest result, describing an application, and placing the video in front of the next person who searches for dog kennel ventilation solutions in a humid climate. The community that forms around honest, specific practical knowledge sharing is more valuable than the community that forms around enthusiasm for a product, because the honest community continues to generate useful information as conditions change, as applications multiply, and as viewers in different circumstances try the system and report what they found. Enthusiasm dissipates when the product disappoints. Honest reporting, including honest reporting of modest results and unexpected applications, builds a record that remains useful indefinitely and continues attracting viewers whose problems the knowledge addresses long after the initial release of the video. The one thing the comment section cannot tell you is what your specific result will be before you build the system and measure it, because your result depends on your climate, your specific vent geometry, your airflow conditions, your carbon grade, and a dozen other variables that are unique to your installation. What the comment section can tell you is what people in similar conditions found when they tried it, which is the closest approximation to a personal prediction that a community knowledge base can provide. That approximation is more useful than any single number the video can quote, because it comes from people with no stake in impressing you and no reason to report anything other than what their thermometer actually showed. The single tray at a single vent is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. What this video has established is the principle and the basic implementation, enough to build a functional installation this weekend and begin experiencing the dual benefit of evaporative cooling and activated carbon adsorption at any intake opening in any space where living things need better air than they are currently getting. What it has not addressed is the situation that tests the principle most severely, the one that arrives without warning and stays for days, the one that kills flocks and fills emergency veterinary clinics and generates the kind of losses that a small farm or homestead does not easily recover from within a single season. A genuine heat wave is a different problem from a hot afternoon. The distinction is not merely one of degree, but of duration and accumulation, because the physiological damage that heat and poor air quality inflict on a flock compounds across consecutive days in a way that a single afternoon's stress does not. A flock that experiences one hot afternoon and then recovers overnight in cooler air enters the next hot day with its physiological reserves largely intact. A flock that experiences 5 consecutive days of temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, with overnight lows remaining above 75, enters each successive day with less reserve than it began the previous one, and the cumulative deficit reaches a threshold where losses become probable rather than possible, sometime between the 3rd and 5th day of sustained heat. Managing a whole flock through that kind of sustained thermal event requires more than one tray at one vent, and the strategies for scaling the basic principle to a multi-vent coop, combining it with supplementary interventions that address the thermal mass accumulation in the building's walls and floor, and timing the maintenance operations to maximize the system's performance during the critical peak heat hours of the afternoon are the subject of the next video in this series. The strategies include methods that require nothing beyond what is already available on any working farm, cost nothing beyond the materials already in use for the basic installation, and address the specific failure modes of the passive system under sustained extreme heat conditions that push it toward the edges of its performance envelope. The next video will open inside a coop on the fourth day of a genuine heat wave, because that is where the stakes are highest and where the difference between knowing these strategies and not knowing them is most visible in the condition of the birds. It will follow Elias through the full management protocol he uses during sustained heat events, from the pre-dawn preparation that sets the system up for the worst of the afternoon to come, through the midday interventions that extend the cooling margin during the peak heat hours, to the evening management that determines whether the flock enters the following night with enough physiological reserve to survive a fifth consecutive day above the critical threshold. Beyond the management protocol, the next video will address the structural modifications to co-op design that amplify the passive system's performance during sustained heat, modifications that can be made to an existing co-op in a single afternoon using materials from a farm scrap pile, without permanent structural changes and without tools beyond a handsaw and a drill. These modifications address the single largest limitation of the passive system in sustained heat conditions, which is not the performance of the charcoal tray itself, but the thermal mass of the building's walls and floor, which accumulate heat through the day and release it through the night, elevating the baseline temperature inside the coop before the following morning's heat begins to build. The flock that comes through a 7-day heat wave intact, producing eggs through the worst of it and showing no respiratory symptoms on the 8th morning when the weather finally breaks, is a flock whose management during that week was as much about preparation and timing as it was about any single intervention. The charcoal tray is the foundation of that management strategy. What comes next is the architecture built on top of that foundation. And it is the architecture that separates the flocks that survive a bad summer from the flocks that do not. Subscribe before the next video arrives, because the next video is the one that matters most on the days when the temperature forecast says the heat will not break for a week. The comment section for this video will be checked before the next one is finalized, and the measurements and applications that viewers report from their own installations will shape which specific scenarios the next video addresses in most detail, which means the community being built in the comments is directly influencing the content being built for them. A comment reporting a specific failure mode encountered during a hot spell, a tray that dried out faster than expected, a vent geometry that produced uneven airflow through the carbon bed, or a humidity condition that pushed the system below useful cooling performance, is a comment that identifies a gap the next video can fill. The knowledge Elias carries from 30 summers of managing poultry through southeastern Pennsylvania heat extends well beyond what a single video can transmit, and the transmission will continue as long as the questions being asked by the people building these systems reflect genuine gaps in their understanding rather than a desire for reassurance that what they already know is sufficient. The gaps that matter most are the ones that appear during the conditions that matter most. And the condition that matters most for a flock of birds that cannot leave their building is a sustained heat wave in July, when everything the basic system can do is already being done. And the question becomes, what else can be done by a person with scrap lumber, activated charcoal, water, and a working understanding of how heat moves through a building over time? That question is answered in the next video. Build the tray this weekend. Measure the result honestly and report it in the comments with your location and your climate. Come back when the next video arrives with the knowledge of what the basic system does and the curiosity about what the complete system, scaled to a whole flock through a week of sustained extreme heat, looks like when it is built and managed by someone who has done it 30 times and knows exactly where it succeeds and exactly where it needs help. The air in your coop and your bedroom can be better than it is right now, for $7.15 and one rule that must never be broken. Everything after that is refinement, and the refinement begins next time.